Mm. Hello. We appear to be live, I believe, I hope anyway. Can anybody hear me? Is anybody out there? An echo? Oh, for flip's sake. Hang on a second. Oh. Apologies. Is that any better? Sorry, I accidentally deleted the video camera as a source rather than the double entry for my microphone. So hopefully the echo should be gone now. Okay, cool. Right. Much better. Excellent. Superb. Right, so for those of you who are wondering why I'm not coming to you from the usual desk, unfortunately it is England and therefore it is raining, shockingly. And with the rain, in the conservatory where I normally film these live streams, there is a massive amount of drum beat. So all you'd hear is occasionally my voice over the echoing rocking of the drums. So once again, I will be going through the Patreon live stream questions first, and then I'll be coming to questions from the chat afterwards. So if you have a question for me, then it's probably best to wait until I get to the end of the Patreon Drydock sections. Although I am Derp Squad, I am recording that question for answering later on. Let me just stick that in the text file. So it's just all a bit, this is all a little bit last minute. I had to remember to reset up my account on my PC. There we go. Right. Okay, so yeah. Right, so let's get on with the question, shall we? So Sir Liv asks, and this is a follow-up to the last Drydock live stream about the Jellicoe Specials, which I had to go off and do a little bit more research on to make sure I was talking accurately. So many thanks to the Discord member who had a lot more information he was able to provide to me on the subject. The Jellicoe Specials being coal trains, of all things, so named because they were taking coal from various mines, Welsh mines obviously, as well as mines in the north of England, to the Grand Fleet. And even though they were coal trains and therefore not exactly the world's swiftest of trains, even by 1914 standards, they had absolute priority. So it did not matter what you were on the line, whether you were an express train, a local train, another goods train. If there was a Jellicoe Special coming, it had vital coal for the fleet, and you got out the way, or else. Some people are saying I'm a bit quiet, so I'm going to try and move the microphone closer without overtly interfering. So let's have a look. That's irritating. Stupid pop filter. I'll move that. There we go. Right, so yes, that's the Jellicoe Specials. He also asks a separate question, which is, following the Battle of Jutland, why did Jellicoe not press court-martial charges of insubordination and refusal to acknowledge and carry out the orders of a superior officer in battle against Beatty? Now, Beatty, yeah, in the aftermath of Jutland, the Admiralty was scrambling to try and find out what exactly had happened first. And then once that had been established, the fact was that they were in a propaganda fight with the Germans. And obviously the Germans were saying, oh, we have won, we have killed many of your ships and lost none of ours. The British were saying kind of the reverse. And so regardless of what Jellicoe may or may not have wanted to do at the time, he was not really in a position to take Beatty to task over some of his failings. I mean, some of them weren't even apparent to Jellicoe. All he knew was that Beatty wasn't replying. The circumstances of exactly why and what was going on in the fleet would only come out later on. But even if he had, it would have been incredibly bad from a political standpoint and from pretty much every other standpoint for Jellicoe to turn around and start taking strips out of his battlecruiser fleet commander whilst the Germans are basically saying, oh yes, the Royal Navy is a bunch of incompetents and they weren't able to really do much to us. Well, then if the Grand Fleet Commander starts taking publicly issuing body blows to the battlecruiser fleet commander, then it looks like the Germans have actually got a point. And by the time all of that was kind of out the way, Jellicoe had moved on to other things, and Beatty was in charge of the Grand Fleet and started rewriting history to his own way of seeing things, which was, shall we say, unique. We can probably say that, at least. Now, there we go. Right. Now, where's my text file gone? There we go. So, yeah. Unfortunately, politics takes a toll in those cases. Stanley Evans asks, why did the Spanish build capital ships out of mahogany? There's things like Santissima Trinidad. Basically because, whilst it might seem somewhat ridiculous to us, because, you know, mahogany is really expensive, and it would cost an absolute fortune these days to build a ship out of mahogany. At the time, mahogany was a lot more available, and it was a very hard-wearing wood, therefore would make an awful lot of sense to make a ship from if you're talking about a warship, because it would resist gunfire pretty well. And it was available in, okay, not massive numbers, but it was relatively common, certainly compared to what it is today. And so, given that they controlled the mahogany forests, why not? Imagine how many, if Santissima Trinidad had survived, just how many fancy cabinets you could have made out of it. But yeah, so that was that. Rodney McCoy asks, he said, after seeing one of your videos, something you said about never wanting to engage in a fair fight, you always want the odds in your favour. So a question comes to mind. When do you run and when do you stand and fight? It depends on your objective. If you, I mean, the thing is, if you've got into a fight where the odds are relatively fair, or even if the odds are relatively stacked against you, then as a serving naval officer, you would probably try and stand and fight anyway. The only times, and even when you're horrifically outgunned and outnumbered, the fact of the matter is that when that usually happens, you've usually got something that's very vital behind you that you're protecting, and something has gone horribly wrong somewhere, like the Battle of Samar, at which point you still have to stand and fight. And you make the best of it that you can. If you are badly outnumbered and outgunned, and you don't have any particular larger objective that will be served by you standing and fighting, then fair enough, withdraw. The thing about never wanting to engage in a fair fight is not so much about once the circumstances arise, it's more about when you are going into that fight in the first place, when you're heading out on the mission, make sure you've got as much accurate information about enemy strength as you can, and try and make sure that you stack the odds against them before you head on out. And then that way, when the enemy show up, it doesn't matter if they show up in small numbers, large numbers, or medium numbers, you theoretically still have the superiority of firepower, and you can Who is calling me at this time of night? Excuse me, I'm going to have to put that on mute. Never the world's most popular person when it comes to telephones, but there you go. Yeah, right. There we go. Anyway. Where was I? We were talking about engaging in unfair fights. So yeah, try and stack the deck against your enemy as much as possible, and then work from there. If you have to fight against the odds, then you fight against the odds. So be it. But it's in your favor. It's in your interest to stack the deck against the enemy as best you can. Of course, the other side's trying to do the same thing. So, such is life. I know a few people have commented briefly in the chat, so I'm just quickly going to address that before we go forward. Basically, variants on where do you get the art behind you. This is a piece of artwork that I commissioned. Where did I commission it? A few months ago. That's available as a poster. This one's on canvas because it's my personal copy. So yeah, that one's on canvas. HMS Hood is hiding behind it at the moment. This is a print from I think the 19th century that a viewer sent me. This is the USS Missouri commemorative postal stamp and frame, also sent to me by a very kind viewer. And this one, HMS Nelson, which is part of the set that has Warspite and Hood hiding behind it over there, they're part of a set that I bought back in 2002, I think, which is really annoying because they, as you say, they're really nice bits of artwork, but for the life of me, I cannot find them again. The only three clues I have are there's a signature on one of them, there's a copyright on one of them, well, on all of them actually, in the bottom right corner, a little copyright notice, and there is the eBay seller themselves. The eBay seller themselves, their account is long ago shut down, so there's no chance of tracking them down. The copyright on there is C.R. Instone, C.R.INSTONE. I can't find a single thing online about who on earth those people are, and the signature is for a naval artist. That much I can actually track down, but the webpage that has some of his work, it shows a similar art style, which does suggest it is prints of his artwork, but he doesn't have these ships on there, so I don't know what's going on with that. And yeah, wherever that's happened to go off to, I don't know. I did try emailing him, but I never got a reply. Kyle Hardman, that poster, it's on etsy.co.uk/Drakinifel. There's A4 and A3 versions. They're actually all sitting over there. I've got to go and post the ones that people have bought this week. I think it's something like £5 and £8. £5 for the A4, £8 for the A3. They're on fairly nice semi-plasticised paper, so they shouldn't bend or anything. Yeah. Okay. Right. So, I see Dr. Clark is in the chat. I'll take a note of Robert Williams' question for the end as well. Right, let's get back onto the Patreon questions. Whee. Right, so that's Rodney McCoy's question. Next, how did this is from Tom. how did the maintenance interval of coal, and let's assume high quality coal, and oil-fired boilers evolve on warships from 1914 to 45? Some combination of operating hours and real-life examples would be interesting. And could a well-maintained oil-fired warships in World War II steam at its designed top speed until it ran out of fuel, or would it result in engine damage? A well-maintained oil-fired warship could definitely in World War II steam at top speed until it ran out of fuel, which wouldn't be too long, to be perfectly honest. I think even if I remember correctly, with something like Iowa, even with the massive amount of fuel that carried, I think if it ran at top speed, it would be out of fuel in about a week. So yeah, there's you can definitely manage that, and the engines will run at top whack for a week or so. Sorry for the flickering light in the background. It's the fact that the YouTube live stream background now is all dark with their new service, and the text document is bright, so every time the text document pops back up, it's a massive glare because there's a 42-inch TV screen that is doing all of this. Maintenance intervals they were much longer for oil-fired boilers, and it depended on how long you ran them on. So if with just on-board maintenance, day-to-day stuff, oil-fired boilers in World War II could run for weeks, months even, if they weren't being overly taxed before having to go back into dock for a little bit of work. During World War II, you typically saw ships going in for a variety of maintenance, which would include work on their boilers roughly every 4 to 6 months where they could, but there were cases of ships that would run a lot longer than that. Coal is a much more different issue because obviously the much higher amount of particulate emissions in terms of soot and smoke and such, especially, and even if you're running on high quality coal, you would have to haul in to scrape everything out much more often. There's not an awful lot of a difference between that kind of stuff, maintenance, and the kind of maintenance you'd have to do on a steam train, for example, because they work on pretty much the same principles. Right. I have no idea how to pronounce this. PHPH Lash? Okay. Asks, suppose Tonner's number 6 search plane completed its flight on time and at full range and discovers Task Force 16 or 17, so this is Midway. Nagumo now fights with a clear head. Well, that'd be a first for Nagumo. And Midway ends with 3 carriers sunk on each side, leaving the Kido Butai with, say, a Kagi and its full complement of capital ships. Would Yamato have moved on Pearl Harbor or play it safe and consolidate its Far Eastern conquests? Also, would the US Navy have responded by building a mirror to the Yamato class battleship lines? Or was the superiority of carrier power already so well accepted by June 42 the USN would continue building more carriers as it did? Derp Squad says he's got to leave in 10 minutes, so could I answer before then? Okay, well, I'll answer this question, and then I will, let me just make a quick note to answer your question next rather than going on to the next one. Right. Yeah. So, question. So, assuming, well, if 3 carriers are sunk on both sides, that's everything the US has at Midway. That's not good. If the entire Yorktown class goes down in one day, then that means that they're down to Wasp and Saratoga, and neither of them are available at that point. Saratoga's still being repaired, and Wasp is over in the Atlantic, so that would leave the US with basically nothing. That would be very, very, very bad. So yeah, that's something of a scary prospect. Yamato would not have moved on Pearl Harbor. The Japanese could fuel their ships for a strike on Pearl Harbor, but fueling their ships plus an invasion force plus sticking around long enough to conceivably deal with the forces the Americans had in Pearl Harbor, that's going to be way too far for the capabilities of the Japanese Navy at the time. So yeah, they're not going to be. They're not going to be going off after Pearl Harbor anytime soon, although some in the Japanese hierarchy might want to give it a go. I think Yamato would probably tell them, no, there's plenty of other things to do. And to be honest, if you've knocked out Yorktown, Hornet, and Enterprise, you've got pretty much free range to do what you like, because you're going to have Shikaku and Zuikaku coming back online, and if you've still got Akagi, even if the US managed to bring Wasp and Saratoga up to speed in the following few months, you're still outnumbering them somewhat. And once you keep factoring things like Rugio, etc., the Japanese would have a significant advantage up to the point where the Essexes start to come online. So I don't think the US would have switched over suddenly to making Yamato Mirror class battleships because, well, one, they didn't know exactly what the capabilities of the Yamato were, and two, at that point it would have been all hands on deck to get as many carriers as possible into the vicinity, and yeah, they would have been begging the Royal Navy to send over the USS Robin a heck of a lot earlier. Whether or not the Royal Navy could afford to do so is another matter, but yeah. So getting over to Derp Squad's question, because he is having to go soon. He says, can you give your opinion on the divinity of the Blackburn Blackburn? The Blackburn Blackburn. There certainly is something supernatural about the Blackburn Blackburn. Whether or not it is divine in nature, on the other hand, I'm somewhat doubtful of this. If anyone wants to, have a look at the Blackburn Blackburn. It is a monstrously ugly thing. It's basically a gigantic flying engine, prop engine with biplane wings, a 2-level set of cockpits, because the engine is so huge that a cockpit on the normal level the pilot wouldn't actually be able to see through. So he's tucked up in this tiny little slot underneath the top wing, and it's got a top speed that would disgrace a World War I era fighter. Okay, now fair enough, it's an early 20s reconnaissance torpedo bomber, so maybe it's not that much further advanced, but still, like, planes in 1916 were faster than this thing. This is the kind of aircraft, especially with that kind of frontal surface area, where you get an albacore style effect where destroyers can start to overhaul you if there's a particularly strong headwind. Yeah, Britain has a lot of aircraft designs to be proud of. The Blackburn Blackburn is not one of them. Unless, of course, you want to go by, we've proven that we can get such a thing to take to the skies in defiance of most known laws of physics and decency. Which I suppose technically might be something to be proud of in some strange way, but who knows. Yeah. Mind you, with that much engine space, I'm kind of curious to see what kind of engine space what kind of engine from World War II could fill that engine space, and then exactly how fast it could go, or would the wings rip off? Oh well. Christopher Hamilton asks, he says, first, a clarification of the question he asked last month about how large amounts of sea ice in Andoria's oceans would affect naval ships. This was a Star Trek question. I was more interested in ships of equivalent technology of 1900 to 1950. And an add-on, how would Andorian naval tactics and strategy differ as a result? For example, would it have even been possible for the Andorian navies to build aircraft carriers? They probably wouldn't have needed to. Because to be honest, if you're using icebreakers on your equator, then the rest of the planet is going to be like super thick ice. At which point, the whole reason for having an aircraft carrier is to take aircraft to places they can't otherwise land. Whereas in that scenario, you wouldn't really see any aircraft carriers, because if they needed to land somewhere on the planet, they'd just land on an ice floe. Ski fighters would be actually... Ski-equipped fighters and ski-equipped bombers would be a major component of the Andorian Air Forces. Ships of equivalent technology in 1900 to 1950, they did exist. Icebreakers moved on quite rapidly, as with most steam and steel and iron technology in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. So some of the very earliest ones still worked on the kind of almost Roman trireme principle of ramming into things, but pretty quickly they cottoned on to the idea of this sort of scallop spoon-shaped bow that could ride up over and use the ship's weight to crush the ice, which is the principle behind pretty much all modern icebreakers. And so there were quite a few of them. There were, for example, in the Baltic conflict in 1919 and 1920, one of the major aspects of that was who controls the icebreakers. The Finns managed to steal a couple from the Russians, for which they were very, very rightfully proud of. I think the Estonians managed to get one at some point. Another one got left behind because it got damaged, and the Russians managed to keep one or two others. So yeah. Tuning 3434 asked, why didn't I include the Blackburn Blackburn on the Fleet Air on poster? Largely because it wasn't in service, thank goodness, by World War II, and that's a World War II era poster. Right, so next question on the list. Who's this? Oh, Rafael Jaztek, I think. So yeah, well, we're going to go with that because there's no way I can pronounce that any better at this point in time. He asks, if in alternative Washington naval treaty situations, all nations get to build one ship that will be a pride of the Navy. Only limitations are that the ship is restricted to 100,000 tons for the US, 75,000 for the British. 100,000 tons for the US and British, 75,000 tons for the Japanese, and 60,000 tons for all other nations. What kind of ships do you see each nation building? Italy and France probably don't build any because, especially France is bankrupt. They couldn't even complete the Normandies. They're not going to be completing a 60,000 ton monster. The Japanese at 75,000 tons, well, that's probably actually pushing something around the number 13 class, so they'll probably go for that. The US and the British, well, the US theoretically have the Tillmans. They could probably break out one of those and try and upscale it slightly. The British are just going to put their heads in their hands and cry quietly in a corner because a 100,000 ton ship is going to mean they just do not have the space anywhere to actually put the thing. 100,000. I mean, 100,000. The draft on that thing, you'd have to undergo massive expansion of multiple UK ports. I mean, if the Americans do go for like I can't believe I'm going to say this, a Tillman on steroids, the British would have to respond, but they'd be muttering and cursing the entire time, I think. So yeah, that would be quite the feat, I would say. I don't know what they'd build. 100,000 tons, probably. I mean, the only thing that I can think of that the British ever designed at 100,000 tons was one of the sort of immediately post-World War II design concepts for at this point, Lion in name only, that had sort of 12 inches of deck armour and was designed to be proof against tall boys and rocket-assisted tall boys. Yeah, I'm at a loss. I mean, even Fisher's Incomparable is a less than half that displacement. Oh, mind you, this is Fisher we're talking about. He may very well just try and persuade everyone to build a catamaran incomparable. That is something that Fisher would probably go for. BFW says, I know you don't normally do post-World War II, but what major innovations in hull form and hydrodynamic understanding and seakeeping happened post-World War II? This is part of the reason why I don't go past World War II, because some of that stuff is fairly opaque to me, and to be perfectly honest, an awful lot of the innovations in hull form, hydrodynamics and seakeeping that happen post-World War II that go beyond things like the transom stern, the refinement of the bulbous bow, are mostly things that go into the things like supercarrier hull design, and the US is somewhat cagey about that. They really don't like telling people what their aircraft carriers underwater hulls are like. At least they didn't until recently, when some Bright Spark published a bunch of photos of the Nimitz in Drydock. So yeah. Unfortunately, I can't really help you there. But if you happen to pop that question over to Dr. Alexander Clark, he can probably fill you in a lot better than I can. I say my knowledge kind of starts to run out in terms of definitive knowledge once you reach the end of the gun era, so some point in the 1950s. When it comes to missiles, I know a bit more about the more modern stuff, but when you want to talk about things like Terrier, Talos, etc., I'm just going to put my hands up and say there are people who know that stuff much better than I do. Although I can tell you that Sea Slug was not really good for much other than terrifying the life out of everybody in the vicinity, because it more closely resembled the launch of a Saturn V than a surface-to-air missile. Yeah, unfortunately, the chalice for the Iron Brew is in the conservatory, and I just took one look out the door and went, no, this is incredibly noisy, I'm just leaving it. Warren Jervey asks, Nelson was notorious for his long-time affair with Mrs. Hamilton. Have there been other famous admirals who have had similar liaisons that were either ignored due to the admiral's worth to the fleet or were dismissed because of it? Yeah, senior officers and affairs are something that happens quite often in navies, especially in the old school Age of Sail navies. Generally, if they were doing a particularly good job at sea and they did a reasonably good job of concealing it on land, then people would let them get away with it. If it was peacetime, that could be the make or break of the career, because during peacetime people could put things like social status and discretion much higher up the list of things. So yeah, that would be, yeah, in times of peace, yeah, if it was a kind of, well, we could promote this admiral or this admiral, but this one is having a relatively indiscreet affair, well, then we can kind of poke at him and go, ah, yes, you are morally corrupt and indecent and bad for the service, and drum you out. And then yeah, but I think probably maybe off the top of my head, if I'm listing off most of the famous admirals sort of pre-1860, I'd say probably about 30-40% of them were carrying on an affair of some kind. Max Kerstetter. Ah, yes, this is from the Albonian question from last week, or last live stream, wherever that was. Asks, how would you fix the work of the previous traitor Albonian Minister of the Navy after he was discovered in 1950? No replacements unless the ship is truly hopeless, as many traitors have harmed our once deep pockets. Oh, I really messed up the Albonian Navy with my last set of choices. How to fix them? If I can't replace them, oh, now I do have problems, because I can't really do anything about the hangar height on the Illustrious class I made them by without ripping the ship apart, and that's going to cost money, which you said can't do. Because in theory, if the box girder structure would stand up to it, you could take out the middle deck on the double decker ones and on like Indomitable, but the Worcester class with the 6-inch or rapid fires, through trial, error, and hitting it enough times with a wrench, you can probably make those work eventually. You just have to spend a lot of time and be very sweet with the Americans. And having a bunch of ex-Kriegsmarine high-pressure machinery, it kind of worked as long as there was very highly trained Kriegsmarine crew. So suddenly it would be like Albonian passports for everybody who used to work for the Kriegsmarine, who knows anything at all about the machinery. Outside of that, it's very difficult to fix. I did kind of go to town on picking ships that really couldn't be fixed very easily, if at all. I think I did the traitor bit a little bit too much. I might have to review that live stream. Yeah, sorry, Class A Cornet. I meant last month. I didn't do a stream last week. But I am thinking of doing 2 streams a month now because the number of Drydock questions has grown exponentially again, which is not helping my time. Anyway, Gabriel A. Hawkins, if you were captain of HMS Anson in an encounter with Musashi or Yamato, and you exhibited that irksome English penchant of standing your ground in the face of a superior adversary, well, that would be a fun fight. Would you use a full HE rounds rather than armor-piercing shells prior to closing the range, since AP shells are likely to bounce off of anything substantial in Musashi, whereas HE would degrade Musashi's ability to fight by destroying its fire control? Given Anson's slight speed advantage and higher rate of fire, would it actually have a reasonable chance of prevailing by using such a technique and only moving in for the kill after degrading Musashi's ability to fight? Yes, at long range I'd use HE because, as you say, my AP's not going to do much of anything at that range. What I would do... What would I do as Anson if I've got to stand my ground? I'd probably use my slight edge in speed to get away, assuming that the weather is half decent. And I'd just try and hold on until either poor weather or night sets in so that I can use my radar-directed fire control systems like Duke of York did on Scharnhorst, and then go in with those. And yeah, I'd probably expend my entire HE stock at sort of medium to long range to just try and plaster everything that Musashi has that's breakable, like, say, fire control systems and rangefinders, before moving in. And hopefully at that point, having completely destroyed its ability to counterfire me, poke around and try and work out where can I put a 14-inch AP round somewhere that will actually hurt. And probably cursing the fact that I'm the only British battleship that doesn't have a torpedo launcher equipped, ironically enough. Oh, boy. Yeah. I mean, this is the thing with the Yamato Musashi. Pretty much anything up to and including an Iowa is on a downward slope to bad things, when if you're ending up fighting them in a nice, calm, open-air environment during the day. But that's why you would, in either case, Yamato or King George V, unless, you've got something spectacularly important immediately behind you to defend, you would just hold off use your superior speed to hold off until the weather and or night conditions favour you. ET says, so HE spam from World of Warships is a bad tactic. Yeah, in that case, you might as well. Oh boy, it's not a fight I would want to be in. That would be a classic example of a fight where, yes, it's perfectly acceptable to back off. But you might as well give it a go if you can't do anything else. Chris Gregory, with the obvious exception of French pre-dreadnoughts, what was, in your opinion, the ugliest vessel in each era of warship? Sail, steam and steel, dreadnoughts, treaty era, etc. In the age of sail, I'd probably, and much as I know this might not go over well with some people, but I'd probably have to go with one of the American ships of the line, because one of the nicer things about Age of Sail ships of the line is they have the nice bow, they have the nice stern, and they have a sort of a gently curving tumble home hull to them, and that's kind of the classic shape of a ship of the line. Whereas the US Navy, in an approach that actually in some ways would see a repeat of in the North Carolinas, South Dakotas and Iowas in World War II, went with bow, stern, slab sides. So yeah, I mean that they had their reasons. I can't argue with that, but they don't look quite as nice as some of the others. Although I must say, Pennsylvania's imitation of I Am Gigantic floating literal wooden wall, it has its own appeal in and of itself. Steam and steel era, so we're talking 1860 to pre-dreadnought. Ugliest. Ooh, there's a lot of competition in that era. There are some really bizarre ones. Weirdly enough, I'm going to go with What am I going to go with? I think I'm going to go at that point with probably HMS Scorpion and HMS Wyvern. They are, yeah, they would probably go not in their form where they've got their side plating up. They don't look too bad, but they look incredibly weird once that side plating is down. You've literally got full bow, and then it's like someone's just cut out in paint a rectangle section of the entire middle of the ship. Because you've got this tiny strip, waterline strip, and then a full stern at the back, other end. I mean, HMS Captain, as awful as it was, at least had the good sense to have a flying deck above the turrets so that it at least looked vaguely like a ship. Dreadnoughts. Worst looking dreadnought. One of the ones that's stubbier, definitely, because the longer ones tend to look quite sleek and elegant. Probably the Corbett's or the Britannias, to be honest. I know it's the French again, but the French idea of what constituted a good battleship design was not an aesthetically pleasing thing until pretty much the Dunkirks. Which is really bizarre, because they suddenly switched from ugly as sin, oh lord, what happened to my eyes, to actually, with the Dunkirks and the Richelieu, some of the nicest looking ships of their era. Maybe they just shot all the previous... Actually, no, it's France. Guillotined all the previous designers and got new ones in. Then we have... Oh, and post-treaty. I don't think there were any massively ugly post-treaty battleships. They all have they either all have their own charms to them, or they just flat out look good. Michael Thomas, assume the US and UK immediately turned on the USSR, as in the wildest dreams of General Patton, and continued a land war in Europe in the immediately after the German defeat. What significant impacts do you think they would have had on the naval war of the Pacific? Specifically, what do you think the Soviet Navy in the Pacific would do? Would they attempt to ally with Japan, or how would the naval and logistical assets impact US strategy? With the best will of the world, the USSR, the Red Navy in the Pacific would have just died horribly. To an unbelievably unfathomable degree. Even the Japanese Navy at the end of the Second World War still... right up until almost the very end, still had more numbers than the Soviet Navy did. Certainly in terms of anything large. If you're talking about a naval war in the Pacific, it would have consisted of, hello, we are the US Fast Carrier Task Force, and here are our friends, the British Pacific Fleet. Our many hundreds of aircraft would like to have a word with you. And that would be that. Yeah, it would be... something along the lines of, this is the 479th US Avenger bomber approaching. We would like to introduce you to your Lord and Saviour, the 1,000-pound naval bomb. And my friend over here, if you're not interested in my particular brand of explosive conversion, would like to interest you in his Lord and Saviour, the airdropped high-speed, now functioning Mark 13 torpedo. Yeah, of all the places that would be a bad place to be as the Russians, a naval war in the Pacific would be probably the worst. Okay, we're working through these at a relatively decent rate. Edmund Ressor asks, what would be worst for the High Seas Fleet at Jutland? Green Boy shells, or Beatty and Seymour are magically competent and give Jellicoe the info he needs in a timely fashion, and the smaller engagements near the end are reported to Jellicoe? That's a good one. Given the choices and the number of ships that were hit, I'm probably actually going to go with the Green Boy shells. Because if you look at the utter pasting pretty much all the German battle cruisers took, as well as the fairly severe damage a lot of the newer German dreadnoughts took, with green boy shells that actually would penetrate before detonating, even with the Beatty and Seymour doing their thing, there still would have been an awful lot more losses to the German ships, at which point the night engagements, whilst the night engagements would have given the entire Grand Fleet another crack at the Germans in the morning, with those problems with shells, it probably would have amounted to a lot of damage and not too many sunk. Whereas, yeah, with the green boy shells, there would just be lots of ships sunk. I think post-war estimates reckon that if the British shells had functioned as intended, i.e. like the green boy shells would actually have done, they could have chalked up half a dozen to anywhere between half a dozen and 9 or 10 additional German ships sunk, which probably would have meant most of the German battle cruisers and a good chunk of their most modern dreadnoughts, which in and of itself turns that battle into a massively lopsided victory without Beatty having to get an iota more competent. Swee420 Den asks, alt history, how many of the most modern battleships, Iowa, Bismarck, King George V, Richelieu, Yamato, etc., would be required to destroy the British Grand Fleet in its Jutland configurations with no modernisation for the Grand Fleet? If you're taking Yamatos or Iowas, I'd say to be slightly on the safe side, but still being quite relatively optimistic, half a dozen, because you would need, I mean, assuming that they're supporting the High Seas Fleet instead of replacing it, half a dozen ought to do it, because between especially with the fog taking the Iowas, with their fire control, they'd be able to take out multiple ships on their own, and then the High Seas Fleet would be able to mop up what's left. You basically want roughly one per battle squadron. So, yeah. Claydon Godet, I'm curious to your reaction or impressions on the music video Bismarck by Sabaton. They're a great military history-focused metal band, and the video was made in collaboration with World of Warships, from what I hear. Yeah, I'm in two minds about that one. It's a good video. It's a good music video in and of itself. The naval historian in me goes, that's buying in far too much into the legend and propaganda of Bismarck than what it was actually capable of doing. But then again, that's kind of the point of a commemorative song, isn't it? I think that aside, and as I say, it's an artistic work. I can accept that, yes, okay, they're going to play up to the trope of Bismarck rather than necessarily the reality of Bismarck. The one thing that I maybe hold against that particular song is that compared to some of their other works, it was a little bit short on content. Because if you listen to it, like, I think it sounds at least like 50% of all the words that are coming out are either Bismarck or Kriegsmarine. Which one's like, yes, okay, I get it, Bismarck was part of the Kriegsmarine. Can you please tell me something else? Whereas, if you look at some of the other Sabaton songs, like When the Winged Hussars Arrive, or the one they did about Rorke's Drift, and some of the others, those have a lot more content to them, I would say, a lot more of the history. So yeah, I think, yeah, if I had to improve one thing about that video, it would be put a little bit more of Bismarck's story in it, and a little bit less of constantly repeating that informing us that the Bismarck was a member of the Kriegsmarine, which I think everyone understood after about the fourth repetition. Out Kaiser. I read about the first destruction of a submarine, HMS B-10, Royal Navy, by an aircraft in 1916 by seaplanes of the Austro-Hungarian Navy. The submarine was docked up in Venice, so it wasn't moving. And then later on, other seaplanes bombed and sank the French submarine Foucault, I think, at sea. Is there any truth to those stories? From what I've been able to tell, yes. I've been very lucky in that one of the subscribers and viewers is from Hungary. Well, I'm sure there's more than one of them, but this one in particular has got in contact with me and has been helping me quite a bit. He helped translate a lot of Hungarian language sources for the video on the bombardment of Ancona. And so far, we have managed to piece together at least that some fairly official documentation at the time does talk about the loss of both B-10 and Foucault to air attack by the Austro-Hungarian Navy, although in both cases, as I say, they don't seem to be active combat, if you like, especially with B-10, which it wasn't a mole, it was actually moored up against a submarine tender. But yeah, that does seem to have happened, at least. I mean, it probably bears a little bit more digging, but it certainly seems to be backed up by some reasonably authoritative sources. Mystic Samurai 1983. Assuming the crews were all of equal skill level, who would win in a fight between a King George V, the South Dakota, and the Bismarck? Assuming everyone's of equal skill levels, I mean, it's a little bit unfair because South Dakota didn't commission till after Bismarck was sunk, so it's naturally going to have more advanced systems. But assuming we kind of substitute in Tirpitz to make it slightly fairer, I'd probably put my money on South Dakota with everyone having roughly equal skill levels, mainly down to those 16-inch guns, because Bismarck is too vulnerable, and King George V, although it has fairly decent substantial armour, South Dakota does have a very good fire control, and assuming it doesn't suffer a short circuit like it did when it was facing Hiroshima, then it should, relatively speaking, have that in the bag, because it should be able to punch very, very hard. It may be, this thing, its armor scheme is pretty good. There are weaknesses in it, but yeah, I'd give it to South Dakota most of the time. Of course, the thing is that they're all, well, Bismarck isn't really a treaty-era battleship, but they're all pretty much on a par with each other. So a couple of lucky rolls of the dice, it could go any way. But if you ask me to put money down, I'd probably put my money on South Dakota. Daniel Ziegler. In all the scenarios where you get asked about a modern warship getting magic back into World War II and World War I, what I want to know is how the logistics would work. How different are fuel requirements between a World War II ship and a modern one, and ammunition? If a handful of civilian contractors get magic back with the ship, would they be able to help World War II Americans replicate a cruise missile? That's an interesting one. The fuel requirements depends on the ship itself, but I mean, a lot of ships these days, a lot of the more recent ships actually run on diesel, so that could be made to work. Bunker fuel, you could probably get away with it. You could probably I think you can make modern ships work on World War II fuel, or at least you'd know how to refine World War II fuels to make them work in a modern ship. Ammunition, that is more of an issue because, well, to be fair, a shell is a shell. For a 4-inch or 4.5 or 5-inch gun, you can make that stuff pretty easily. It's the missiles that are the problem, and they're the primary parts of a modern warship. You're not going to replicate those with World War II tech. The basic problem is that some of the stuff that goes into modern missiles, the seeker heads and stuff, they all rely on modern microelectronics. There's precious little way you're ever going to pull that off in World War II. Certainly nowhere near in time. I mean, you're talking about an era of vacuum tubes, not microprocessors. yeah, that's not really going to be a viable option. You could probably instruct them in how to build something approaching cruise missile, maybe, but yeah, I mean the most advanced stuff was V1s and V2s, and we all know how they didn't quite work out. You could probably make a slightly more accurate V1, but I think the best thing that you'd be able to pull off at that point with World War II tech would be, we've invented a kind of cruise missile that can at least be relatively guaranteed to hit the right city. Shrivorius asks, if you were sent back in time to 1904 with a task of achieving world domination as quickly as possible, and were allowed to take the complete blueprints and production techniques for one piece of 1945 technology other than a nuclear bomb back with you, what would it be and why? One piece of 1945 technology. I would probably take a modern battleship of the period, like a 1945. So probably something like an Iowa. Not for any particular specific intent to use the ship itself, but because engine technology. The Iowa would contain many different types of power plant, everything from its main power plant, which is obviously turbines and boilers for ships, to the aircraft engines in its scout aircraft, to the little portable diesel generators, etc. The power density and technical capability of various 1945 engines and power plants is massively in advance of 1904 tech. I mean, we've said before, it's like the Megami on a power plant that was maybe a third to 40% the size managed to fit more power than Hood did, and Hood is a late 1910s ship, not 1904. So if you show up with all these different kinds of engines in 1904, the power density of your warships is going to go massively up. So you're going to be able to either have really, really fast ships that are otherwise pretty much identical to the way they were, or ships that can achieve the kind of speeds that they used to be able to, but with massively more guns and armor, or some balance where you're a bit faster and still a bit better armored than everybody else. And yeah, taking 1945 aero engines into that equation, you're going to end up with, I mean, you've basically stolen the race of flight right out from under everybody else's nose, and that you can apply the principles of the battleship's engines into all your other warships, into vehicles, into tanks. You might have a tank that moves faster than walking pace, all those kinds of things. So yeah, as a technological upgrade, that would be the thing that I think I'd bring back for use, because other stuff like really a high-tech aircraft, the industry's not really going to be there to support them. Rocketry is pretty much the same, jet engines are the same, whereas more advanced engines, that I think you probably could do. I'm noting the super chat questions. That's the occasional flickering as I copy and paste them into the text, so don't worry about that. And obviously everyone else, once I've finished these listed questions, we will be taking yours as well. We're doing relatively well, I think. Some of the upcoming ones are really long, so that'll take out an entire page at a time. Brian Roper, alternate history Midway. Saratoga is repaired faster and arrives in Aleutian waters to fight Junio and Rugio with its escorts around the same time that the Midway action and Aleutian Guard Force are around. So you have the Aleutian Guard Force, which is Issei, Hugo, Fuson, and Mashira versus Task Force 1, made up of New Mexico, Tennessee, Idaho, Mississippi, Maryland, Colorado, Pennsylvania, and Long Island, which I don't think is a battleship. That would be very interesting. Saratoga's definitely got a bigger air group than Junio and Rugio, and is somewhat more survivable. and that task force of standard battleships against the Iseis and Fusos, that's going to be a one-sided slaughter if I ever saw one. That probably ends with the Japanese Navy going home with its tail between its legs for a second time in as many days. I mean, with the fact that the Saratoga is about as agile as a brick, there is a possibility that if Junio and Rougeau manage to get off a surprise strike, that could turn the tables by crippling or killing Saratoga. But if Saratoga does a half-decent job, they can probably take out the one or both Japanese carriers pretty quickly. And yeah, that battleship engagement is just completely one-sided. Whoops. Yeah, sorry I'll have to copy all these super chat questions, but unfortunately this new setup of YouTube's doesn't really like me. Hang on a second, my TV screen is saying it's going to turn itself off. I just have to lean past and reactivate it. There we go. Right, Mohammed Alibi, question and answer. How would the Revenge class have fared against the Japanese surface fleet? In World War II? Hilariously badly. They would have been outnumbered and outgunned. If you're talking about the Indian Ocean raid, where you've got Congos versus the Revenges, that's a slightly different matter, because the Revenges, they're slow, but they're relatively well armoured against the Congos, and the 15-inch guns will definitely hurt the Congos quite badly. The main thing is that the Congos will massively outrange them, and the Revengers don't really have any way of closing the distance. So yeah, that would be bad. In World War One, if for some reason they were fighting each other, that would be a somewhat different matter, because that would be battleship versus battleship, at which point, yeah, the Revengers would stand a reasonably decent chance. But yeah, World War II, not without a lot of support. Jeffrey Cook, exchange the Italian force with an equivalent German force at Cape Spartivento, Veneto, and exchange the German force at the Barents Sea with an Italian equivalent. How does it change the outcome of each battle? At Barents Sea, it probably doesn't change much, because that wasn't really a technology thing, that was a people thing. It was just such a mess. And to be honest, actually, it probably becomes worse, because at least the Germans had some radar present. The Italians wouldn't really have much of anything, and if they did, it wouldn't be as advanced as the Germans. So that particular hot mess would probably go even worse with Italian ships. The Spartivento battle... See, that's an interesting one. Trying to substitute in is actually very difficult, because, okay, it's easy to go... Okay, the Littorio class that's present, will substitute that with a Bismarck. That's easy. Whereas if we are looking at what do we substitute for the older battleship, well, the Germans don't have any older modernised battleships to put in there, but I suppose we could maybe put Scharnhorst in. Given that those guns will now actually shoot straight, that possibly ends worse for the Royal Navy, because they don't really... They've got battleships there that can fight a toe-to-toe fight with Bismarck at close range, because similar levels of firepower. But something like Ramillies is not going to be taking on Bismarck in a long-range gunfight, mainly because it can't do a long-range gunfight as far as sort of Bismarck and Scharnhorst can. But the whole thing's a bit of a messy beating engagement as well. So overall, the equivalent German force, as much close as you can get it at Spartivento, that's probably going to end better for the Axis, whereas an Italian force at the Barents Sea is probably going to end worse. The Senkari asks, It's 256 BCE. The Roman fleet is preparing to sail to fight the Carthaginians off Sicily in an effort to land a Roman army in Africa and end the First Punic War. The Carthaginians, who've had the greatest name in the world for most of living memory, are confident of victory, but still offer prayers for divine intervention just in case. Looking for a ship with a suitably distinguished ramming career, the Carthaginians suddenly end up with SMS Kaiser. Yes, that SMS Kaiser, presumably Admiral Tegethoff's flagship, in the great harbour of Carthage. Now that would be a sight. Fully provisioned and armed, but lacking any crew or instructions. However, Mars and Neptune have got together and decided to intervene on the Romans' behalf. Because if the Carthaginians cheat, the Romans will as well. So the Romans find HMS Dreadnought. Provisioned, fueled and armed, but lacking crew and instructions that wouldn't ordinarily be on board. What happens next? The Carthaginians got by far the better end of that deal, I think, because whilst, yes, they might not have any instructions or crew aboard the Kaiser to tell them how to operate it, well, one, it's still a sailing vessel. They will probably figure out how to at least mostly operate it fairly quickly, even if it's not completely ideal. And even if they can't, being a large wooden ship of the line, Kaiser is still probably within their capabilities to tow. And they'll be able to get a few sails working, and between that and the Carthaginian fleet, they can probably just about contrive to get the Kaiser out there. Dreadnought, on the other hand, much as it is significantly larger, they're not going to figure out running the Dreadnought in any time soon. And at almost 20,000 tons, well, no, yeah, around about 20,000 tons displacement, there is no way the Dreadnought is getting towed anywhere fast, even by multiple Roman ships. Plus, also, yeah, I mean, working out the cannons is a little bit of a tall order for the Carthaginians, but it's conceivable that they might. Whereas, working out how to operate the shell loading, aiming, and firing systems of the Dreadnought's guns is just no. He says that, the Romans could put torsion artillery in every spare inch of the deck of Dreadnought and archers and slingers on it, etc. Yeah, they could, but I just can't see them towing it anywhere. Certainly once the wind blows up, even if they somehow manage to get it out of port, the wind will just take it off somewhere else. Whereas Kaiser would actually probably just about be semi-workable for the Carthaginians as a combat vessel. Actually, now I have funny ideas of SMS Kaiser just randomly bumbling along, crushing Roman triremes left, right, and centre, which is quite amusing for me. Admiralty of Floof, what is your favourite alternate history -- what if you haven't mentioned it yet? Could you give a short little teaser and outline? Oh. Favourite alternate history -- what if? That is a good one. I don't tend to like them. I don't tend to like them too much because I like the concept of alternate histories, but I find that an awful lot of alternate histories that have been written and published, at least the long form ones, they tend to take the author's favoured side and really play it up to degrees where you start just rolling your eyes and going, no, this is just a bit too much. Whereas some of the shorter alternate histories can be quite interesting, but they're effectively just short stories rather than proper alternate history what ifs. One of the ones I actually quite like is The Two Georges. I think it's by Harry Turtledove. I could be wrong. That takes place in an alternate kind of World War One-ish era USA, except that the point of departure is that the USA never gained its independence. But one of the reasons I like that particular one is because it's not about how in this alternate timeline this one country triumphs over the other. The fact that however it happens that the American Revolution fails, it's just a background piece of history that happened. The actual story is just set in a sort of a fait accompli world where the US, the greater US, is a British part of the greater British Empire, and then it focuses on the story within that setting, which I think is a much better way of doing the alternate history. So I quite like that one. Coltax 100. We are still on Patreon questions at the moment. Unfortunately, there are quite a few, but I'm working my way through them as quickly as possible. Manani Wanderer. During World War II, which Axis and Allied warships would have made the biggest difference if they were switched, assuming they all had all the spare parts, ammunition, consumables, etc. Oh. If you're going to switch for the Axis, then switch in an Iowa for the Scharnhorst, because Scharnhorst and Gneisenau actually managed to get out into the Atlantic to do surface raiding several times, as well as obviously things like Operation Weserübung. They managed to get out and cause the British problem several times, and it was mostly hung up on the fact that as 11-inch gun ships, they weren't quite able to close the deal with. They came across things like Malaya, whereas if you imagine the fight between HMS Renown and Scharnhorst and Gneisenau off of Norway at Lofoten, or Scharnhorst and Gneisenau heading out and, as they coming across things like HMS Malaya raiding the convoys, if they had an Iowa, that would cause a rather major upset in those engagements. The flip side of Axis versus Allied, if you're switching out an Allied warship for an Axis one, what would be that to do? I'm almost tempted to say switching out a Shikaku for USS Wasp. That would be quite fun, and it might actually survive the. I mean, yeah, with the US crew, Shikaku probably would survive the Japanese torpedo that got sent at Wasp. Other than that, substitute Yamato for Prince of Wales. That would be hilarious, because we know just how much damage Yamato took to put down, and Musashi for that matter. I don't think the Japanese attack force that went after Prince of Wales and Repulse physically could hit it enough to kill it. General fake news. Oh boy, this is a long one. Let's try and summarize. Okay, so apparently it's October 1931. I'm Commander-in-Chief of the Soviet Red Navy. Stalin wants to create a Soviet sphere of influence in Central Asia. I have to try and cripple the Japanese fleet so as to prevent them from becoming a threat to Soviet influences in the area ever again, or at least set up a naval blockade. So this is basically Russo-Japanese Pacific War Mark II. How would you try to achieve this, given you don't want to join your predecessor in enlarging dockyard facilities in Murmansk by hand? I don't think the Russians can do it at that point, and I don't think they can build the ships quickly enough to take them on at that point. If my mission is to completely total the Japanese Navy, at that point, I think I would probably just invest in a mass production of submarines and destroyers, and literally just do a massive surprise torpedo attack. Hilarious, given how Port Arthur opened up in the Russo-Japanese War. Yeah, I would just come as a bolt from the blue, swarm the Japanese with endless numbers of literal torpedo boats, destroyers, and submarines, and I hope to take them out that way. Charles Fitt, are you familiar with the alternate history narrative The Whale Has Wings by Astro Dragon, and if so, do you think it's a plausible narrative, or is it being too generous to the Fleet Air Arm? I know someone. I think someone asked about this in the last live stream. I have started to have a look through. I haven't got all the way through it because, unfortunately, on the alternate history thread, it's like 700 pages long, most of which is comment, and finding the odd post where you get an update of the actual story is difficult. But so far, I've gotten to I think like early 1940. So far, it's relatively plausible given the point of departure. A few things are a little bit kind of it's going a little bit too right in some manners, but it's certainly not bad. It's certainly not bad at all, and it's definitely a good read. But as I say, I'm only up to early 1940 so far. What else have we got? Graham R. How much capability do you believe the Royal Norwegian Navy lost after the Helga Igstad sank in her collision, and do you believe a replacement vessel will be financially and strategically worth it? I have no idea whether it be financially and strategically worth it because I don't know what the current financial position of the Norwegian Navy is. But as far as capability lost, it represents actually a fair chunk of the Norwegian Navy's ship capabilities, as far as I understand it. So that's definitely there's a reason they kind of tried to salvage her as hard as they could, even if they did mess it up slightly. Yeah, when it comes to replacing a vessel, ostensibly I would say yes. If you lose a ship like that, you probably should replace it. But as I say, I don't know exactly what the modern Norwegian defence budget is like. Although, given the history of ships built to a similar pattern to the Helga Igstad and its parent class, I wouldn't necessarily replace it with a like for like. I'd try and go somewhere else. Douglas Peck, alternate history. What if, in lieu of Nelson and Rodney being built, the UK negotiated with other signing parties of the Washington Naval Treaty to let them upgun and modernise the Queen Elizabeths as their entries into the 16-inch armed battleship club? If funding was available and all ships were modernised to Queen Elizabeth-Valiant standard, would having 5 older ships running around with 8 16-inch guns, potentially saving a bit of money and giving the R some attention, be worth it? It does require some hindsight, because see, the main problem with that, you're going to massively overload the Queen Elizabeth. They were slightly overloaded when they were built. If you up-spec them to have 8 16-inch guns Colorado style, the hulls might just about be able to support the larger barbettes if they design a kind of slimline turret, but the amount of additional weight you'd be putting into them, you'd be dropping them down to 23-knot ships, at which point you've basically created a slightly faster British version of the Colorados, only without the all-or-nothing armour. Yeah, I'm not sure it would be worth it, because the thing is, at least Nelson and Rodney were armed with 16-inch guns and designed against 16-inch gunfire. The Queen Elizabeths weren't. So yeah, I don't think that would necessarily have been such a brilliant idea. If the Queen Elizabeths had been built with triples, then yeah, switch up to twin 16s might work. But replacing twin 15s and the excellent twin 1542 with twin 16s, no, I'm struggling. Apothecary Terry says, I feel like Patreon questions should be for the non-live Q&A. As I said, the live, with the purpose of this live one is that the alternate history and slightly more wacky Patreon questions get answered first, and then I pick up questions from the chat. That was kind of this was kind of my fudge factor way of trying to work with the fact that the last Patreon Q&A had something along the lines of 134 questions, And given that I can only get through maybe half a dozen in every normal dry dock of the Patreon questions, answering 100+ questions for the end of the month dry dock, it's not practical. I can't do it. Sorry. So I've tried to kind of split it into two, but then the numbers are running away with me again. So yeah, I don't know what I'm going to do. I'm going to have to think of something. But we shall see. We will be taking the live questions later on. As I say, my normal policy is we do the Patreon questions, and then I keep going till I run out of iron brew and run out of voice. And the good news is, the sugar content of original brand iron brew, well, original recipe iron brew, is enough that even though I was completely shattered going into this, I'm on a semi-permanent sugar rush for this entire live stream. So up and until my voice starts giving way, you don't have to worry about me just collapsing unconscious. Timothy Sims asks, what if Admiral Donitz had started World War II with 300 operational U-boats he had requested, and Radar had Graf Zeppelin and her sister operational? If Donitz had his 300 U-boats, that might very well have caused Britain to go to the negotiating table. Certainly. That's not a fun prospect. To be honest, at that point, having Graf Zeppelin and her sister is basically irrelevant to the fact there's 300 U-boats! Help! Given how close things were in 1943 when Germany had significantly fewer U-boats than that, yeah, that might very well force Britain to the negotiating table, assuming that they're used properly. Yeah. Cypher, history. If you could go back in time and give each era of ship design blueprints for one piece of technology or design, what would it be? From now. Ooh. That's a very good question. See, the problem is most stuff today relies on computers, and you could give them blueprints for a computer. There's not an awful lot that anyone could do with it. Sir Liv, I notice you are asking basically a question I answered at the top of this live stream. So yeah, your question has been answered, and I will elaborate on it a bit later on if you want. What else are we doing? I mean, yeah, P.O. Hamachi makes a good point. If the Germans had built 300 U-boats, the Royal Navy would have been cranking out escorts like there's no tomorrow. But still, even though the Royal Navy was cranking out escorts like no tomorrow, as I say, by 1943, things were still very perilous. So just because you can build a theoretical counter doesn't necessarily mean it's going to work. If I was going to give, going back to Cypher's question, Age of Sail, I'd give them Seppings and Simmons design blueprints for cross-bracing structural members to improve the strength and size of ships. Pre-Dreadnought-Ironclad era, I'd give them blueprints on more efficient engines, and possibly a bit about a bit of information about how to manufacture steel armor. Then what else could we do? I mean, they'd need like Bessemer process foundries if you go back early enough there. And if you were going to go with the sort of 1910s, 1920s, 1930s era of the Dreadnought Battleship, I'd probably see if I could dig up some kind of radar system from radar fire control system from the late 40s, early 50s, and that sort of the whole kit and caboodle, and dump that back in like 1905 or something or other like that. Billy Tyson says, more modern question, but hope you can answer it. With the Zumwalts largely being considered a failure, it was recently postulated they might be effective if used in a similar manner to an old school cruiser squadron. Well, hopefully not the one that was made up of Abukir, Hogue and Cressy. Do you think such a concept could work in modern times, and do you have any thoughts onto whether the Zumwalts are redeemable in any way? They're redeemable. The hulls themselves are pretty good. You just have to fit them with weapons that actually work. And whether that's going to be cost effective or not, I don't know. But they've certainly got the space. And yeah, if you put them with actual fully functional weapon systems and basically made them like gigantic air defense destroyers and sailed them all together, that would be a very, very effective fleet, little cruiser squadron. I have said on bilge pumps, I do think one of the things that the US could do in the modern era would be to have a actually even larger surface combatant than the Zumwalts, something in the order of a 20 to 25,000 ton ship. Oh, we're very nearly near the end of the Patreon stuff. And yeah, I would actually have those with then minimally manned, highly automated escorts, and just go with a sort of basically effectively a battle cruiser kind of concept, as I accompanied by these minimally manned escorts, and use that to leverage technology, because then you have all the power generation and volume you need to put lasers and railguns and massive missile batteries and everything. I mean, if you can fit almost 200 missiles in a Sejong the Great at just over 10,000 tons, you can definitely fit an awful lot in 20 to 25,000. Christopher Whitmer, what do you think is the best idea in naval development that didn't work out because of politics or a lack of ability to implement? If you're going to go with politics, the Imperial Federation idea that was kicking around immediately prior to World War I, which would have gotten the various colonies, etc., to basically buy their own fleets or contribute heavily to the Royal Navy in exchange for sort of industrial build-up and developing their own countries with British aid, that would have been a very, very good idea, because that would have expanded the Royal Navy, well, I guess the Imperial Navy at that, actually, yeah, it would have expanded the Imperial Navy at that point to make it truly unassailable by unlocking the economic potential of a good chunk of the British Empire instead of just having Britain build everything. And also we'd get to have the Imperial Navy. You could then legitimately have like the brass band of the Royal Marines playing the Imperial March as a wonderfully painted fleet in black, white and tan sailed around the seas with multiple flags from different places like Canada and Australia, New Zealand, etc. flying. That would be fantastic. Now I kind of want to commission an artwork of that, but I don't know, can you do kind of like one of those open greeting cards, put a little Imperial March soundtrack chip in it or something? Christopher Brandt, could Operation Sea Lion succeed, or at least be not a total failure, if the Italian Navy had somehow made it around to the occupied French western coast? Could an Italian task force as well as Italian troop transports have made an impact on the outcome of Operation Sea Lion, or would it still be a catastrophic failure? 1940, they're not going to have the Littorios around, so it's going to be the older battleships. If they arrive by surprise and the Germans are waiting for them, they could at least make it not a total failure, because with the numbers of Italian destroyers, cruisers and their older battleships, they would be able to at least be able to force the Royal Navy into committing absolutely everything into it to try and stop them, which would actually be quite the interesting battle, considering that large chunks of the Royal Navy weren't present. They were off doing other things. So yeah, they could definitely make it succeed in the short term. Whether or not they could sustain it against the losses they'd be suffering in the long term is another matter. But yeah, if we're going to hand wave somehow, the Italian Navy somehow makes it all the way around to the French west coast and Germany has enough fuel to keep them running, then yeah, that's probably one of the few scenarios in which you could get Sea Lion to succeed, at least in the principle of landing troops in the first place. Miko Lightning, tell us about the Battle of Banks. Oh, come on. Finish? Really? Benktskar. I'm going to call it Benktskar. If you want to call it to tell me different, then spell it phonetically, please. Then, yeah, okay. Well, it is added to my list of Wednesday videos. I actually had a look at that in preparation for this live stream, and yeah, it's something that we do need to talk about. But yeah, it's definitely worth talking about. But I don't think I could do it justice in a dry dock 5 minutes or so. It's quite the fun activity. Plus, also, to be honest, going into it, I'd probably pronounce it so horribly there'd be a bunch of Finnish people coming to kill me, and they're quite scary. Just ask the Soviets. Chris Hopwood, who would win if the World War I Royal Navy was transferred to current times and updated like for like modern ships versus the current Navy? Well, the World War I Royal Navy, obviously. If you bring the World War I Royal Navy through to current times, update it like for like in modern ships and set it against the current Navy, then the only thing the current Navy has in its favour is 2 carriers. I mean, and maybe not even that. I mean, if we're going with the principle of capital ship for capital ship, then the Grand Fleet is either turned into 3 dozen carriers or 3 dozen nuclear ballistic missile subs or something like that. Maybe what's fast attack? So maybe the battle cruiser fleet turns into aircraft carriers and the Grand Fleet turns into ballistic missile subs. At which point the new old Royal Navy now has the largest ballistic missile submarine fleet in the world. Possibly more ballistic missile submarines than everybody else has combined. And yeah, the Royal Navy at the moment has 6 destroyers and a dozen or so frigates. Do you want to see what happens if you take the World War I Royal Navy's destroyer fleets and go, right, you're all now Type 45s? that would be quite fun. Last Patreon question. Good news, everybody. Last Patreon question, and then we are on to the super chat questions that I've missed, and then we're on to everybody else. So we're getting there. 22NF2. Could HMS Prince of Wales and Repulse have evaded the aircraft of the Japanese Navy in the South China Sea? And if yes, how much damage could Force Z have done had they eluded the Japanese? Could they have done to the Japanese what Bismarck set out to do to the British in Operation Rhineboom, perhaps more effectively? Would it have made a difference if they'd had air cover from Royal Australian Air Force's number 453 Squadron, or waited for repairs to be done to the radar Prince of Wales before setting sail? Could they have evaded the Japanese aircraft? Maybe, but not likely. By the point once they were spotted, they were in trouble. Yeah. Prince of Wales potentially could have evaded the 1 torpedo to its stern. That's a bit more of a more realistic butterfly, at which point it would have had a lot more fighting capability. Whether or not they both would have survived at that point, I'm not sure so much. If they somehow had, yeah, well, if they hit the convoys, those would be pretty nasty. I mean, they'd also be sailing into Japanese cruisers, and that would be a very interesting thing, because you'd have radar-equipped British warships, albeit one of Prince of Wales's radars was broken, but you'd have radar-equipped British warships as a whole fighting night actions against Japanese cruisers, who are also very well trained for night actions and loaded with lots of long lances. So that would not have been a pretty scenario at all. Daytime engagements probably actually would have favoured the British at that point, because they can see the Japanese cruisers coming from longer away. If they'd had air cover, that could have made all the difference, because the air cover doesn't even necessarily have to drive off the Japanese attacks, really. They'd have to break up the pincer movement by the Japanese aircraft on repulse, and as long as they can break up the attack or shoot down the attack run that hit Prince of Wales's stern, that changes enough that they probably could survive to get away. Right, so catching up on the super chats. Robert Williams asks, got to ask, USS Olympia versus Aurora. Aurora is a newer design. Olympia has heavier guns. Olympia's shooting is not brilliant in the well, not the Russo-Japanese War, in the Spanish-American War, Aurora's gunnery is all right in the Russo-Japanese War, but those two wars do kind of sort of bookend one of the first major advances in naval gunnery, so that's perhaps a little bit unfair. I mean, on paper, assuming equal skilled crews with equal ability to fire at the reasonable ranges of their guns, Olympia should probably win because of the heavier firepower, and as long as it can take advantage of that heavier firepower, it can stand off at range and engage the Aurora beyond a range that Aurora can meaningfully reply. So technical advantage to Olympia, assuming all other things being equal. Raymond Leone, is the play button new? There. It's not new, strictly speaking. I've had it for a little while. It used to hang out over here, but it used to hang out kind of semi-hidden behind the chair. So it's probably just a little bit more visible now, he says, having half covered it with his chair. Wesley Johnson, polar ice caps are stolen by aliens in 1919, and the aliens replaced their displaced water. How does this affect post-World War I fleet construction? If you lose the ice caps, then there's probably going to be an ecological catastrophe of the scale that no one's building warships in the post-World War I era. They're all going to be desperately trying to salvage the world economy. Although, on the other hand, if the world economy goes down the pan, that could lead to everybody and their dog going after each other, trying to sort out who's going to be king of the scrap pile, which could very well ending quite nastily. So you're going to end up in two ways, I think, at that point. Either because of the ecological catastrophe, everyone's bunkered down and is trying to help each other and doesn't have any fleet construction because they're just trying to survive, or alternatively, everyone's desperately churning out as many ships as possible because they've gone Mad Max and decided that if they can't rule, no one can. Ryder Strano. Afternoon from the deck of the historic fireboat Firefighter. Very well named. Do you have any similar boats or ships in the UK? There are some firefighting ships in the UK. I don't know if we've got any preserved historic firefighting fireboats, which would be a shame, actually, come to think of it. I mean, I've been to most of the preserved museum ships around, and I can't think of any off the top of my head that have a fireboat. I think that I've seen one in a museum somewhere, a relatively small one, but unfortunately I think that's about it, which is a shame. You have to let me know where that fireboat is, or maybe I can look it up, but yeah, maybe I can add it to my now what's probably looking at an optimistic attempt at trying to rebook my US tour next Easter. We'll see how that goes. Catchbay asks, if you visit Vasa at Stockholm next summer, can you make a trip to Helsinki too? As it would be nice to meet you next to Crichton Vulcan CV707, i.e. U2A. Don't see why not. I mean, if I'm going to fly over there, I might as well make a little bit of a trip of it. Yeah, sure. Assuming, of course, that flying is possible and safe at that point. But yeah, why not? Jason Lawrence, how can you drink Iron Brew? Tastes like bubblegum Fanta. This stuff doesn't. It tastes like Iron Brew. I don't like bubblegum flavoured drinks. I like bubblegum flavoured ice cream, but not bubblegum flavoured drinks. So, and I also really don't like Fanta. So I can trust me, it doesn't taste like bubblegum Fanta, because that's possibly one of the worst combinations. I mean, even when it comes to orange flavoured fizzy drinks, I prefer Tango over Fanta. Right. Then UNSC forward on to Dawn. Hi, Drac. Hope you're well. Last time I checked. So far, so good. If money was no object, which scrapped Royal Navy ship would you bring back from the dead? One ship from each type. Battleship, battlecruiser, carrier, heavy cruiser, light cruiser, destroyer. Battleships. I bring back Warspite. That's not going to be a surprise for the battleships. battle cruisers. Much as I'd be tempted to try and bring back Hood, I do really, really like Renown as well. I'd have to toss a coin between Hood and Renown. I have a feeling I might actually end up bringing back Renown. Carriers. Carriers. Ark Royal. The old Ark Royal. Mainly because of that. If I'm going to flip a coin between all the various carriers, mainly because of that stupidly high flight deck. Yeah, when your flight deck's 10 foot higher than the flight deck on a Nimitz class super carrier, you're tall. That would be amazing. Also, I'd kind of want to convert it, if it's a museum ship, I'd kind of want to convert the bow into kind of some kind of like high diving centre. Just leap off the bow into Portsmouth Harbour. That might be an interesting way of committing suicide. CA cruiser, heavy cruisers. Bringing back a heavy cruiser. That will be a coin toss between Exeter and Suffolk, I think. Bringing back a light cruiser. We've got Belfast. Light cruisers, Leanders, Arethuses, C classes. Well, we've got Caroline, so that's the C class covered to a degree. Bring back Ajax and destroyers. Destroyers. What would I bring back for a destroyer? Probably Cossack. HMS Cossack. Oh, Rich Sutty. Any recommendations for visiting the for Royal Navy bases in Malta to visit? The fortifications are very nice. One of the things I've always had an ambition to do if I get to visit Malta is when you look at a lot of the photos of Royal Navy ships in the Grand Harbour, they seem to be taken from 3 photo points, almost all of them. I kind of want to find where those photo points are. Animal 16365. Best and worst treaty ships, battle cruisers and destroyers. Worst destroyers, probably the French super destroyers, because they didn't work at high speeds and they put a massive amount of effort into making them high speed. Either that or some of the German ones that decided that really, really wanted to be U-boats. Although the German ones weren't really adhering to any kind of treaty, so probably in that point the French contre-torpilleurs, because they could have got a lot more use out of them if they'd dialed back slightly on the speed and put a few more guns on them or something, or anything other than just turning them into vibrating washing machines at high speed. Worst treaty cruiser? Probably the Duquesnes. The Duquesne class is probably one of the few I actually agree with on Anthony Preston's World's Worst Warships, because they're heavy cruisers with practically no armour. Worst treaty battleships. There isn't really a worst treaty battleship. They're all really pretty good for what they were. The problem is things like a lot of them, like the Bismarcks and the Littorias, aren't treaty battleships. Richelieu's pretty decent. King George V is pretty decent. South Dakota's good. Yeah, at that point, if you're pretty much left by process of elimination with the North Carolinas, because the Japanese didn't build any treaty-era battleships, well, apart from maybe the Nagatos, but Nagatos, Colorados, and Nelsons, they're not particularly too bad. Yeah, if you're going to go with worst treaty ships, you probably have to go with the North Carolinas because of their speed issues and the fact they weren't armoured against their own guns. But the armour part is explicable, and the speed issue is annoying. But it's not. It doesn't make them awful ships. It just means that they've got a slightly larger Achilles heel in their design than everyone else's, but there's a fairly high bar when it comes to treaty ships. John Hart, the French fleet joins the Britain in 1940. Britain can put together a large Pacific fleet in 1941 for Singapore. How does this affect the Pacific War? Oh, that's an interesting one. If the entire French fleet in for 1940 goes, yeah, no, Herr Hitler, we're going off to fight with the UK. See, I don't. It may actually be a net negative, because it means that the British force, the British Pacific Fleet, is probably going to be on the receiving end of the Kido Butai at the height of its power, before the US has had its way with them at Midway, and before everyone's kind of appreciated just how much of a danger the Kido Butai actually is. And also, to be honest, even with the French fleet, the British was stretched so far trying to deal with the Italians in the Mediterranean and the Germans with Bismarck, etc. I don't think they'd put much more of a large Pacific fleet into the Pacific in 41. It might well put them in a much better position to support the US in 42, so the USS Robin mission might be considerably larger. But I think, to be perfectly honest, if the French fleet joined the British in 1940, by the time they've sorted everything out and got Richelieu pumped up and working, they're probably going to spend 41 dealing with the Italians in the Mediterranean and putting a bit of more of an iron collar down on Germany, and then heading back into the Pacific in mid to late 42. At which point it is going to affect the Pacific War quite considerably, because if the Japanese now have British forces coming in from the west and American forces coming in from the east, they're going to be in a bit of a world of hurt. Although, given how close Guadalcanal and the Solomon Islands is to Australia, it's entirely possible that there might be considerably larger British force basing in Australia and thus helping the Americans out in Guadalcanal, which could change things quite considerably in the various engagements that are going on, especially when the British brings a lot of surface search radar into the equation. Nolan Sester, in Shattered Sword, Tully and Partial propose the idea of Midway decisive battle, and the US is propose the ideas of Midway Okay, I need to read this question again. In Shattered Sword, Tully and Partial propose the idea that the ideas of Midway as a decisive battle and the US's inevitable victory can't coexist, as the latter precludes a decisive battle. Your thoughts? A decisive battle as in a war-winning battle? Maybe. But I think you can have a decisive battle at Midway, whilst still having the idea of a US inevitable victory. Not so much in that it's a war-ending battle, but it can be a war-turning battle. Because the thing is, if the US had lost badly at Midway and the Japanese had got their decisive battle, then the US would inevitably have won, but it would have been a lot slower and more painful. Whereas, the US pretty much got the best as it could hope for at Midway, to be perfectly honest, and that informed the follow-on actions. So a decisive battle, as in it affects the entire not necessarily the outcome, but the entire course of the war. Then yes, you can have the decisive battle. In terms of the war is won or lost at Midway, no, then that's not going to happen. Rodrigo Diaz de Vivar asks, what were the French and Russian fleets doing at Jutland? The French fleet was mostly in the Mediterranean, bottling up the Austro-Hungarian fleet in concert with the Italian fleet, and securing a passage, not so much as in 1914, but still securing passage to and from French North Africa for French troops. The Russian fleet was mostly well, it was sitting in the Black Sea, facing off against Goeben, and it was sitting in the Baltic, waiting for the Germans to try something. Because if you look at how the Russians in the Baltic would need to exit, that's quite the difficulty for them. I think they're not going to have fun at all getting out of the Baltic. They've got to go around Denmark. It's far too easy an interception for the Germans to pull off. It's not that they very wisely stayed put. And to be perfectly honest, outside of 1914, the Royal Navy wasn't really at much chance of losing a full-on fleet engagement. So why risk sending out a few ganguts and crippling your own home defence? Galdir Ioni asks, Je Nicole deathmatch, Yamato versus Yamato's displacement in PT boats. How does that play out? How much did the PT boat weigh again? Let me just double check. Mm-hmm. 56 tons. 56 tons. So you're getting almost, but not quite, 20 torpedo boats per 1,000 tons, and Yamato's pushing 65 plus 1,000 tons, so that's well over 1,200 torpedo boats, 1,200 PT boats. Shockingly enough, Yamato is not going to win, because at that point you could just line the PT boats up next to each other, drive forward in one big wave, unleash your torpedoes, and Yamato would basically be erased by explosive abrasion by the sheer number of torpedoes, assuming the torpedoes just don't kill each other on the way in. But yeah, Yamato's displacement in PT boats is going to win that fight. Good one, though. Silver Fox 575, if in anti-submarine warfare of World War I video you mentioned that ideas were open to the public and they received several entries, what were some of the more interesting ideas they received, and were any of them used? Not too many of them were used. A lot of them were shall we say unique. There was one that talked about basically making a high-powered harpoon gun, basically taking the harpoon guns that were being thought about for whaling, and upping the charge on a monstrous version of one of those to literally spear a U-boat as if it was a whale. Yeah. I mean, technically it might work. Then you've got the problem that you now have a U-boat on a string. Now what do you do with it? You'd have to have some pretty substantial boats to stop being hauled along by the U-boat. Yeah, none of them really made a massive amount of practical use. There were enough crazy ideas in the Royal Navy, like rowing up to the periscope with a hammer and breaking the thing. At some point I need to make Drax patented anti-U-boat device, which would just be a little toffee hammer in a presentation case with instructions. Fafix 666. Battle of Santa Cruz. Rear Admiral Abe takes his vanguard force and, in the spirit of Japanese commanders, sails to meet Task Force 61 as soon as it's been discovered. Can he give battle? If so, what is the result? And how does it affect the night battles in November? Let me just double check Abe's vanguard force. Battle of Santa Cruz. There we go. So, the Santa Cruz Island Order of Battle. So he has heavy cruisers. He has Congo and Haruna. You've got the carriers as well. Oh, that's a nasty matchup. Because you've got well, you've got South Dakota. You've got plenty of U.S. cruisers. It's gonna be an interesting one, because if this is pre South Dakota, fighting with Kirishima. Yeah, that's if it's still suffering from the same electrical problems. That could be a problem. Let me just check. When was the fight with Kirishima? It's afterwards. Okay, so South Dakota potentially suffering the same issues with electrical issues. So at that point, if Abe sails out, if he can give battle, he's certainly fast enough to. What's the result? If he can make it a night action, he's got a half decent chance. I'd be tempted to say he didn't have a chance, because South Dakota versus two Congos is still on paper on favour of South Dakota, but because this is pre-engagement with Kirishima, it's going to still be having those electrical problems. So there is a plausible nightmare scenario in that case where South Dakota loses electrical power and then is now at the hands of two Congos who are going to be firing AP shells at it, and there isn't a Washington in the area to rescue it. We already know that the Japanese were pretty good at night fighting, and the rest of the cruisers can at least hold off the American cruisers, even if it's a bit of a mess. How would it affect the night battles in November? Very badly, because obviously South Dakota's not going to be around, only Washington's going to be around. And to be honest, if the US heavy cruisers and the South Dakota are lost, the US is going to have some severe problems trying to find extra ships to cover for the later battles. So yeah, that could potentially be very, very bad for the Americans. But then the flip side, of course, is that if Abe does surge forward, he might get spotted by American aircraft on the way in, at which point the first big American airstrikes go in against his vanguard force and just sink or damage a bunch of them, which the US can then move in to finish off. So it could go either way. There's very good outcomes that could be plausibly argued on both sides. William Kruger, World War II Japanese light cruisers. Why didn't they build more? There must be light cruiser concepts out there. Because they take time to build, and Japan... Bear in mind, a light cruiser, on average, unless you're the States, takes about 3 years from keel laying to commissioning. And given that the Japanese enter the war in the end of 1941, so effectively 42, that means that even if they got started on some light cruisers right at the beginning of 42, without any delays, without any damage, without any resource shortages, and without having to divert labour to repair damaged ships, they're still not going to see any of those light cruisers until early 45, late 44, which by that point is really not any help to them. Yeah. DM Carpenter points out that South Dakota's electrical problems were less systemic and more a certain warrant electrician who thought wiring down breakers was a good idea. Yeah, but yes, that's true. But at the same time, off the top of my head, I don't know when he started doing that. And there's basically what I'm saying is, after the sinking of Kirishima, they would have known that was a thing that he shouldn't have been doing. And they would have known the reasons why he was, some of the underlying issues that he was still doing it. But before that, he may well have been doing it, or there might have been general electrical problems that haven't been solved at that point. So I say it's a possibility, but just not a not necessarily one I'd put money on. This is the thing with a lot of these confrontations. It's very possible to construct in those kind of things. It's very possible to construct plausible scenarios, even if there's mildly edge case for both sides winning. And then you have to try and work out from there, okay, if these are plausible, but which one is the most plausible? And the answer's probably lying somewhere in the middle. Archangel Glenn, assuming equally trained crews who would win through a fight Belfast, Cleveland, and Agano. What did Agano ever do to you? That's a fight between a Belfast and a Cleveland, at which point depends on the range. See, the thing is, one of Cleveland's greatest strengths is AA firepower, but that's not going to help it too much in this regard. Belfast has torpedoes still at this point, so I'd give it 60-40, maybe 65-35 to the Belfast, mainly on the basis of the fact it can, because they both ships have 12 6-inch guns, both ships have reasonable amounts of protection, both ships have good fire control, both ships have radar, but Belfast can hit Cleveland with torpedoes and Cleveland can't. So, yeah. E.T. I don't know if this question will catch Drax's eyes, but would you be willing to trade the Fighting Temeraire, the painting, for the actual HMS Temeraire to be preserved by HMS Victory? If you could guarantee that it was preserved, yes, in a heartbeat. Mock Harris, where exactly do the armour schemes of South Dakota and North Carolina classes differ? Oh, that's a huge question. There's quite an extensive amount of difference actually there, because the North Carolina's armour scheme basically comes down to the fact that it was originally designed with 3 quadruple 14-inch, so its armour was designed to be proofed against 14-inch rounds at reasonable battle ranges. The South Dakotas were, we know we've got to fight 16-inch guns, well, because we've got 16-inch guns, so we need to revise the armour scheme. The overall armour thickness wasn't changed all that much for the belt armour, but the South Dakota, for example, went with the internal sloping belt to provide additional virtual thickness against incoming fire. Torpedo defence system wasn't changed awfully much. Deck armour obviously was upgraded a bit. This is one of the reasons why South Dakota is so much shorter than North Carolina, because they've got to fit this better armour protection system plus the 16-inch guns, obviously, into what's ostensibly supposed to be a treaty-compliant hull. So the only way to do that is to shorten the hull, so that you have less extraneous hull displacement. You can use that saved weight on your armour scheme, which is why the South Dakotas end up being such not slow, but cramped ships for their crews. At some point, I do want to do an armour development video, but I realised that there's no way you can cover the development of Dreadnought armour in one video, because there's so many different strands that different nations went down. So I'm going to have to do it in probably nation by nation, and probably even then in parts. So there will be a much more complex and comprehensive answer to that at some point down the line when I get to doing the differences between North Carolina, South Dakota, Iowa, and what would have been Montana. And then I think we're now caught up with the Super Chat questions with this last one from James B. Oh, he's saying, love the content, keep it up. Glad your channel has grown into the lovely community we have here. Thank you very much, and I'm glad you're part of it. Right, thank you. And on that pleasant note, I can close the text file, and I can start looking at everybody's questions in the chat. And just going to refill my iron brew. Right, I have 1 pint of iron brew left. Well, questions are exploding quick. Fleet Fluid Lone Knight, last live stream you mentioned you wished Wargaming did something different with a tier 10 British battleship. What would you have placed there instead? Also, what's your opinion of the new tier 10 Italian battleships? If I was going to do a tier 10 British battleship, I would either go with a hypothetical modernised N3, because at least that was the design the British chose, or alternatively, I mean, to be honest, with the armour that it had, a modernised G3 is probably not quite tier 10 material for a battleship line. It'd be close, but not quite. The other thing I might have gone with is some of the slightly funnier large lion designs they had much later in the war. I mean, there's the auto-loading turret of the Lions with the sort of with the 15 to 20 second reload, which a lot of people thought it might be, or incomparable. But at the time, they didn't want to go above Yamato's 18.1 inch guns. Although putting incomparable, I mean, they're probably incomparable. Would have basically no armor, but it would be funny at least. Yeah, it's just I can understand where they're coming from with Conqueror and Thunderer. But at the same time, putting one of the semi-sketch rejected designs from that eventually would evolve into the N3, and then sort of Vanguard style modernising it. There's options that I think would be better than that. Mr. Beep, if the Germans had a cruiser in Narvik or a battleship, how would the Battle of Narvik turn out? Depends which battle. I mean, the Germans won the first one against the Norwegians. If the Germans had a cruiser or a battleship, I don't think Warburton Lee would have continued in, albeit that if he had, given how much of a surprise he caught the Germans by, if that cruiser or battleship had been in Narvik Harbour, that probably would have been the end of that, which would have been very bad for the Germans. A cruiser in Narvik for the third Battle of Narvik with Warspite is, well, dead. And to be honest, at that point, the only battleship they have is Scharnhorst, and Scharnhorst caught like a rat in a trap versus Warspite would not be a fun fight on either side, but it would be Warspite's battle to lose. So it's probably for the best for the Kriegsmarine, or at least that they didn't. Coltax 100. What if the Kriegsmarine was sent back to World War I to join the High Seas Fleet? Would they be able to win in the North Sea against the British, or would they just drink up all the resources? The main thing would be, where's the German going to find all the oil and diesel to run them? But if you send back the entire Kriegsmarine, so I mean, in terms of vaguely frontline combat capable units for the High Seas Fleet, you'd be talking about Bismarck, Tirpitz, Scharnhorst, Gneisenau, and you might as well throw the 3 Panzerschiff in there, for at least for their firepower, if not necessarily their armour protection. That might, between, if you're talking about late war with the advanced German radar, etc., and obviously their shells and speed, that might well give them the ability to force the British back. I mean, it would depend if they were given free rein to operate on their own, or as part of the German battle cruisers' first scouting group. They'd probably have a lot of success. If you tie them into the High Seas Fleet itself, then you kind of cripple their speed advantage, leaving them just with their gunfire and range advantages, which are still considerable, but taking away their ability to actually pursue would markedly hamper them. Captain Craig, I think, says, I read Graf Zeppelin was to be equipped with a pair of Voth Schneider props on the centre line forward. Why weren't these kinds of props fitted on other large Kriegsmarine ships? Basically, Graf Zeppelin in its final form was one of the relatively lately laid down German ships, and sort of all the other designs, battleships and such, were pretty much finalised before it was. And also, to be perfectly honest, the kind of capabilities that would have given Graf Zeppelin don't really apply too much to a battleship, as it were. 5101 strange symbols. Far Eastern language. Can't tell whether it's Korean, Japanese, or Chinese, sorry. Says, Bliskovica versus Johnson. Who will win in a crazy destroyer duel? Oh. Nobody good. Bliskovica versus Johnson. That would be vicious. I mean, Bliskovica's technically got more guns. And, I mean, they're size-wise. Johnson's got more torpedoes. Has more individual weapons mounts. Who's crazier? The Poles or Captain Evans? I honestly couldn't call it at that point. The problem is both ships are capable and willing of laying down such a withering barrage of fire on the other that it'd probably end up with neither of them coming out of it. There's an interesting discussion about PT boat armaments. BK Zhong, everyone in World War I ends up with their World War II fleets, assuming they stay in their World War II alliances. How would this change the war? Ooh, that's a nice one. That is a net overall benefit to the Allies, I think, because you're obviously Austria-Hungary didn't exist in World War II, so the Austro-Hungarian fleet would no longer exist. The Italians are now on the Allied side. The French presumably have got Richelieu and Jean Bart to complete. They probably would be able to, assuming that the infrastructure's come across with them. I mean, given that there's no longer a threat in the Adriatic, I don't know, what would you put? What would you put in place of Goeben? Would you exile Scharnhorst or Gneisenau off to Turkey? I mean, the Russians have basically got exactly the same fleet, only slightly less, but a bit more upgraded. But yeah, I mean, if the Germans have got their historic fleet, the British have got their historic fleet, but they don't have to worry about the Japanese either. Oh yes, of course, the Japanese are allied with the British as well. Yeah, this becomes very one-sided, because now all of a sudden the Japanese have got the Kongos, they've got the Fusos and Iseis, they've got the Nagatos, they've got Yamato and Musashi. The Italians are running around with the Littorios and all their modernised ex-World War I ships. The French, at the very least, have Dunkirk and Strasbourg. And they're all on the same side. And yeah, there's no Austro-Hungarian opposition. You can park any significant sized warship off of the Dardanelles to contain one of the Scharnhorsts if you do happen to designate them as being stuck there. At which point, but even if they're not there, you've now got Bismarck, Tirpitz, Scharnhorst, and Gneisenau versus basically the full and unadulterated attention of the Royal Navy and probably significant parts of the Italian, French, and Japanese navies, who have all turned up wanting to get their name on the kill list. And similarly, the Royal Navy is now able to focus all of its anti-submarine warfare efforts on the U-boats, with the help of everybody else, presumably. And once the Americans get involved, then it gets even more fun. Yeah, flipping Italy and Japan over to the Allied side, and deleting Austria-Hungary's fleet, and then giving everyone World War II fleets. The World War I allies would just be thanking you for no end. Luke's asks, was there any plan to send Graf Spee into the Pacific instead of heading back into the Atlantic, and could it have worked with the Japanese? I mean, it made it into the Indian Ocean, but the thing is, it was there as a commerce raider, and yeah, what's it going to do? In the Pacific, there's not an awful lot of British trade for it to go after, and certainly nowhere near as much as was in the Indian Ocean and the Atlantic. And at this point, Japan is still neutral. Graf Spee is around much at the very beginning of the war, long before Japan actually gets involved in the war. So, Yeah, no, it's not going to go to the Pacific at that point. If it was somehow still around by late 41, then yeah, it probably would, but that's practically impossible. Its engines were pretty worn out by the Battle of River Plate anyway. The Royal Router. How effective would the 8-inch Mark 16 guns as mounted on the Des Moines class be in an anti-aircraft role? Not greatly. I mean, the Des Moines class rate of fire is massively increased versus conventional 8-inch guns. But rapid as it is for that purpose, it's still not anti-aircraft role rapid. Not in the way that the 3-inch or even some of the 6-inch guns could be. And also just numbers. You need, in that kind of environment, in late World War II, late 1940s anti-aircraft gunnery, you need to be throwing as much weight of shot skywards as possible. Larger individual shells, sure, they'll be really, really destructive if they hit, but a 6-inch shell that hits nearby is going to be almost equally as destructive. An 8-inch shell is just massive overkill. And also, obviously, they can't track and elevate as fast as a 3-inch or a 6-inch gun. Ooh, everything just jumped a bit. Raymond Leone, your live stream has been informative and interesting, but I think my question about HMS Audacious and Jellicoe's flagship was missed. If that's the question of why Jellicoe was on Iron Duke instead of Queen Elizabeth and what happened with Audacious, that is actually being answered in the full dry dock that's going up on Sunday. If that was your question. If it was, then great. I've just answered where you can find the answer to that question. If not, ping me an email or message me on Discord. Or on Patreon, and I will sort it out. Where were we? Oh, there we go. Humphrey Horsehead. What do you think about privately purchasing, restoring and rearming the USS Olympia to go hunt pirates off Somalia? It would be incredibly entertaining. Yeah, that would be quite entertaining if you could find someone to do it, and if you could find a license. The problem is privateers these days, they don't issue privateering licenses anymore, which is a pity. But yeah, if you could somehow engineer a modern privateer license, it would be quite fun. Albeit that I was going to say I don't think the Somalian pirate problem is as bad as it was. But then I just realised that's just because it hasn't been on modern news recently. It could still be quite bad. In fact, from what I remember from some recent email exchanges with a few viewers, it probably actually still is a major problem. So yeah, if you can get a privateer license, go for it. Otherwise, it'll be a bit difficult to find a way to dock. That's Captain Craig again. Ian McShane, I've always wondered about the particulars of naval minesweeping. Any possibility of a video in the future on mines and on minesweeping quite a while ago I did do a collaboration video with Napalm Matter. I think it's in the collaborations playlist on the channel for mines. I don't know if I covered minesweeping in any great detail, but I definitely know I talked about mines. Michael McKenzie, have you got a light cruiser doctrine video on your list? Coming back to my question you answered in part in Armchair Admirals. Kind of. Things with the Wednesday specials, I usually have anything from half a dozen to a dozen different scripts being worked on at any one time. Like, for example, the Narvik video, although that was made this month because patrons voted for it, that video has been sitting in my being worked on file for probably 6 to 8 months. If for those of you who watched it, you'll have noticed some of the track charts and documentation that's there. That's all stuff where I'm even in this environment, I managed to get a secure seat in the National Archives to go and have a look at various documents in about from the Royal Navy file on Narvik, which was massively interesting. Reading through all the action reports and seeing the original photos of the photos that you see all over the place. And actually, very interestingly enough, one of the features you don't see in a lot of the scans and stuff that have been done of those photos is that an awful lot of them have labels and captions underneath that show exactly what those ships were doing and pointing like, oh, this is a torpedo track, this is Eskimo or whatever. But they're put on the back of the photos in such a way that you hold the photo up to the light and then you can see what it's talking about, and then you put the photo down and it's just a photo. And also, it's like, yes, these are the tracks and the logs and stuff that were actually being filled in by the people on the day as they went, or shortly thereafter. It's that part of this is one of the things about naval history that I really love. It I know it might sound a bit trite, but it's like there's a bit more of a connection to, say, Warspite going into Narvik compared to reading about it is great. Seeing a scan of a photo is great, but actually holding in your hand a photo that was taken, like the photo that was taken by Warspite Swordfish of Warspite in action, and actually physically handling the chart, the battle chart from Warspite, knowing that somebody from Warspite's crew actually sat down and drew that and was there and made many funny notations on it, to be honest. It just brings that extra level of connection. But yeah, the Light Cruiser Doctrine video, it's on the list. It's part of the Wednesday specials that I'm working on. It will be complete when it's complete. To be honest, with things like that, one of the biggest problems I tend to have is actually not so much completing the script, but having so much material. It's working out how to edit it down into a format that was half an hour or an hour long. Otherwise, I'd be there for 3, 4, 5 hours plus. Captain Seafort, if Renown and Repulse had been completed early enough to be present at Jutland, what effect would they have had? Probably won't boom. Because if they'd been completed in time, they would have had entirely inadequate armour. They had to be hauled back in again to be re-armoured. I mean, okay, yeah, the 15-inch guns would have made a mess of things that they hit, but they would have been hideously vulnerable. Coltax 100, USS Iowa versus Sovietsky Soyuz in the 1980s, 1 vs 1. Iowa, because Iowa's armor plate is single thickness, it's not made up of laminations. I mean, seriously, laminated plates for armored warships went out of fashion in the 1860s. Mark Bass, are you drinking Iron Brew, the soft drink? Yes. Yes, I am. Malcolm 55. Adrak, 4 months a charm. How come the Brits and Germans didn't adopt 3-gun turrets for their early dreadnoughts as opposed to the US or Austro-Hungarian examples? The Austro-Hungarian examples are actually one of the earliest adoptions of the triple turrets. The Austro-Hungarians and the Russians were the first big adopters of the triples, then followed by the Americans. You've got to remember the triples for American ships don't show up till the Nevadas, which are contemporary with the Queen Elizabeths and the Bayerns. In terms of the triple turrets, by the time the triple turrets start showing up on the Russian and Austro-Hungarian ships, it's kind of seen as a choice of triple 12s or twin larger guns. And the British and the Germans, they tend to escalate the calibers first rather than go for the multiple turrets. I mean, the triple turrets are still fairly technically complex, and the British especially really like the reliability and ease of use of twin gun turrets. So yeah, that's basically why they don't adopt them anywhere near as fast. And then you've got the thing is, you've got who knows what they would have done post Revenge class. They may have gone for twin, basically similar kind of layout and everything, just on a slightly bigger hull, but with twin 16s, or even bigger. Or they might have gone for triple 15s or something. We don't necessarily know. There were various design sketches looking at all sorts of things prepared during World War One, but not a lot of them got anywhere apart from obviously Hood, which had twins because it was supposed to be battlecruiser Queen Elizabeth. But yeah, it's the thing is with the triple turrets for the US, most of their triple turreted stuff, especially the stuff that's built with all triples, as opposed to Nevada with triples and twins, this is all built during when everyone else is fighting World War One, so they've got the time and the space to develop their designs. Whereas the British are basically finishing off stuff that they started at the beginning of the war. Nick Walters is imagining replacing my Iron Brew with WKD. You can try. You can certainly try. Okay, I need to catch up with some of the questions. We're doing quite well. I mean, we started at 7. It's now 9:30, so I think we can keep going a little bit. I've got half a glass of Iron Brew left. Okay, I can't read Cyrillic. But whoever you are with the orange anonymous avatar with the Cyrillic name, yes, you the one who asked how does a semi-oil power plant work, I am answering your question. I'm sorry, I don't read Cyrillic. Certainly not in a way that would be anywhere close to pronounceable or intelligible. But anyway, how does a semi-oil power plant work? Basically, it's a normal coal-fired power plant, but it has oil sprayers mounted in the top of the boiler in the furnace area to spray oil onto the coal flames. So it's mostly coal-driven with a kind of an oil top-up to increase the thermal output of the boilers. And also means you can... obviously, it's slightly easier to run because for a given overall power output, you don't need to shovel as much coal. Galdir Iona, imagine a world in which, for whatever reason, air power doesn't take off, and it's now the age of the super battleship. How big could those things have gotten? I tend to think around about the 60 to 80,000 ton mark, and 18, maybe 20-inch guns, but 18-inch probably more realistic, maybe just about 20. That's probably about as big as they could practically get before there would have to be a massive revolution across the world. I mean, we know the French had issues having enough infrastructure and shipyards of sufficient size to build the ships that they were trying to build with Dunkirk, Strasbourg, Richelieu, Jean Bart, etc., and what they're planning thereafter. By the time you get to the upper end of things like Hood and Vanguard, the British are beginning to struggle with having very few dockyard spaces and ports that can accept them. The Americans are in a slightly better place in that regard. The Japanese kind of, to a certain extent. The Germans have problems with shipyard sizes as well. But once you get much past Yamato size, you are going to be looking at having to completely revamp your infrastructure, build completely new dockyards, build and dredge new ports. It would be such a massive hurdle that unless someone with some kind of natural advantage in that they already had a port or shipyard of that kind of size was able to build something, everyone will probably cap out around there and start working on refinements. Yeah. Of course, if someone did start working on those refinements, then you'd end up with everyone having to go that way. So who knows where that would have led. Ian Wookie Winter, if Yorktown had been saved at Midway, do you think Wasp would have been used? No. They knew how vulnerable Wasp was, and they brought Wasp in because of the losses that had been suffered at Midway, both in damage and in ships that had gone down. If they'd still had Enterprise, Yorktown and Hornet after Midway, with Saratoga being on repair, they probably would have kept Wasp in the Atlantic. Maybe they would have brought Wasp in after losing Hornet, because the Essexes still weren't available at that point. But yeah, they wouldn't have brought Wasp in at the time that they did. Rambling Rattlesnake, how would a Type 21 U-boat have fared in the Pacific against the Japanese? Pretty well. I mean, it's Japanese without... Japanese anti-submarine warfare is a meme for a reason. They're not entirely without resource because, I mean, this is the thing. When it comes to navies that are bad at something in particular, just because they're bad at something doesn't mean they can't do it. There's a fair number of US Navy submarines on the ocean floor in the Pacific that prove the Japanese could hunt submarines. They just weren't anywhere near as good at it as the Americans or the British or pretty much anyone else was, but they still could. But that said, Type 21 fighting against the Japanese for some reason, it would have been a whole other level of difficulty for the Japanese to engage it. Excuse me. Kaiju Director, Battleship Yamato teleported to a Japanese seaside town a month before Tsushima with 6 months worth of ammo and blueprints for more. What happens next? Japan wins Tsushima even harder. Operation of the Yamato would not be with that outside of the knowledge of the Imperial Japanese Navy in 1905, at least for a short period of time. And if it's a month before Tsushima, Rossesvensky is not going to find out about it in time. Breedley, what's the strongest World War II Navy World War I Britain could beat? Depends if they get upgrades, or if it's just straight up World War I tech. Mr. MZR, rather than retiring by sinking or breaking up of carriers, convert them to hospital ships or cruise ships with flight decks. I don't think a carrier would make a very good cruise ship. Far too much problems. Far too many problems there. Converting it into a hospital ship or humanitarian relief ship, that could be done. Wouldn't necessarily think it would work too well with a nuclear-powered carrier, but certainly with some of the more conventional powered carriers, assuming their hulls aren't completely shot, that could definitely work. Nick Walters confirms that Brits do not all, in fact, live in a yellow submarine. No, we don't. Although at the moment, with the amount of rain that's coming down, it does feel like it somewhat. Humphrey Horsehead, Biscovicia and Johnson versus Yamato. What did Yamato do to you? Howard Maxey, what reinforcements would Rear Admiral Dorman have needed to have a better chance to succeed at Java Sea? A couple of county class? Actually, there were a couple technically available. Yeah, a couple of county class. Maybe if Australia and Canberra had been available, maybe Hobart as well. The main problem with Admiral Dorman's force, apart from the fact that some of his ships weren't really up to the same kind of spec as the Japanese ships, and of course they didn't know anything too much about the real capabilities of the Long Lance, it was more the fact that it was all individual bits here and there. There wasn't any kind of cohesive unit on any particular level apart from the US Destroyer Squadron that decided to wander off halfway through. So, yeah, a single coherent unit of, roughly comparable cruisers probably would have turned the tide a fair bit, whether that be two or three American, maybe two more American heavy cruisers to go along with the one that was already there, or say a couple of counties to back up Exeter, or something along those lines. Dusty River wasn't Boatface Yellow Submarine. Yes, it was. Ian Wookie Winter, would the Royal Navy build more Ark Royal class to replace the older carriers like Eagle and Hermes, as well as building the armoured carriers? That's a very interesting question, actually. They were looking at building some more larger Ark Royal types, but they were also having to operate within the treaty restrictions at the time. To replace Eagle and Hermes, actually Unicorn was in large part going to take over their roles specifically, but Samuel Thompson, Drakenfell finds out Midway's bombers hit your invasion fleet at 15:30 on the 3rd of June 1942. Admiral Drakenfell finds out Midway's bombers hit your invasion fleet. What do you do now the element of surprise is gone? Midway's bombers hit your invasion. Presumably on the Japanese at this point? Yeah, I think that's how it makes sense. So the Japanese... so presumably I'm in charge instead of Yamato or Nagumo. I find out that Midway's bombers have hit my invasion fleet on the 3rd of June. What do I do now the element of surprise is gone? Depends how badly damaged my invasion fleet is. If it's properly messed up, well, you're not going to take Midway at that point, so you might as well just go home, to be perfectly honest. If the invasion fleet is battered, but I still have the overall element of surprise, I might put up zeros and try and catch the bombers on their way back, to be honest, and double my scouting efforts. But then Nagumo was never particularly good at scouting. Yeah, so it's going to depend a lot on whether or not my invasion fleet is still a viable thing. Because let's face it, Midway's bombers didn't have the world's greatest success against the Kido Butai. Adam Bowman, do you know why the US Navy changed from naming its aircraft carriers after Revolutionary War battles to presidents? The switch seems to have occurred with the Midway class when... well, it started with the Midway class when, obviously, President Roosevelt died and they renamed what was to have been Coral Sea to Franklin D. Roosevelt and then bumped Coral Sea a long one. Then, of course, with the Forrestal, you've got things like the Forrestals and the Kitty Hawks, Nimitz, etc. So the process of switching from naming them for battles to naming them for people it's kind of starting along there, along that sort of the conventional supercarrier period. Then you get the Nimitzes, and then they start going full bore after the politicians. I think in part, and definitely once you get to the later ones, in part it's to persuade people to vote in the Congress and Senate to vote to actually allow them to build them to a certain degree. I mean, it's the same reason. It's the same reason that the submarines switched from being named after fish to being named after various, like the Los Angeles class and such, with a famous quote from Admiral Rickover: "Fish don't vote." Yeah, it's become a lot more political. As Dr. Clark is fond of saying, that's why, to a certain degree, we suspect the Royal Navy is naming the Type 31s after the towns, because it makes it very difficult for anyone to vote to cancel them. But yeah, to continue with Ian Wookie Winter's question, would they have built more Ark Royal types to replace the older carriers? Most likely, not exactly Ark Royal types, but they certainly did have some considerably larger, higher capacity aircraft carriers on the drawing board when World War II rolled around. I mean, you can even see with the Implacables, they were kind of trying to get that air group up once they'd worked out how to protect the ships. Furikin, on the question of the Poles, how badly would the Royal Navy have been hurt if the Free Polish Navy had been in control of the Regia Marina? If the Free Polish Navy had been in control of the Regia Marina, the Royal Navy wouldn't have been hurt at all. The Royal Navy might have been slightly scared as to what a bunch of angry Poles equipped with Littorios were going to do, but yeah, at that point, if the Free Polish Navy had somehow got control of the Regia Marina shortly after the invasion, it's like Grand Theft Warship, Midway style again, that would be quite scary. I mean, can you imagine the Bismarck fight? The Royal Navy would just be like, Free Polish Navy with mysteriously acquired Italian ships. A large German battleship is sailing into the Atlantic, and then by the time they finished that part of the sentence, there'd just be a rush of papers and a stiff breeze as the Polish crew leg it down to the shoreline. It's like, oh, well, we've pointed the poles in the direction of the Bismarck. Shall we get some aerial observation up to just watch the fireworks? Archangel Glenn, I don't know if you missed my question, so I'll ask it again. Yeah, sorry if I did. I genuinely didn't see this one. Three-way fight between New Orleans, Tonay, and York. Who would win? York's definitely out because it's light. It's a light heavy cruiser. It's only got 6 guns. So that's New Orleans versus Tonay. The thing is, the Astoria-New Orleans class doesn't really have the world's greatest combat record against Japanese cruisers, if I'm perfectly honest. With First Savo Island, albeit that was a little bit of an unfair fight. Tonay's got the all-forward armament. New Orleans versus Tonay. That's an interesting one. If it's later on in the war, I'd give it to the New Orleans, because it would have the superior fire control. And as we could see from the shot that hit Chikai, the American 8-inch shells, despite having a relatively small bursting charge, do seem to be quite lethal to Japanese cruisers. If it's earlier in the war, where Tonay where we're operating under mostly optical fire control systems, and obviously Tonay's got its long lances and also the capability of operating aircraft to scout, especially potentially at night, then probably actually Tonay. So yeah, early war Tonay, mid to late war New Orleans. Oh, one day I'll find out how that's actually pronounced. Jeramak, biggest gap in the big book of Royal Navy cool names, or best sounding ship names suitable for but never used by the Royal Navy? I mean, they've used a lot of the cool ones. I think the only thing would just be trying to escalate past some of the stuff they used in the 1870s, when you had things like Devastation wandering around. There's only so much further past Devastation that you can go without sounding a little bit off your rocker, because you can go with like Annihilation or Obliterator, maybe even Eviscerator might be pushing your luck a little bit. They do like their aggressive ones, though. Sven Johnson, is there a ship that became a museum ship that you think shouldn't have been preserved, and why? Oh, that's going to be a contentious one, isn't it? If I had a choice, I would probably happily drop one of the preserved Essexes in exchange for getting Enterprise CV6 preserved, if I had that choice. But at the same time, the thing is, poor old Enterprise ended up going to the scrapyard long before any of the Essexes were available as museum ships, so that's not necessarily a fair comparison. I I mean, the thing is, most of the time, if a museum ship is preserved, it's preserved for a reason because enough people want it to be preserved. So there usually is a reasonable justification for that. And to be honest, given how few ships overall are preserved as museums, you'd have to find another ship more worthy of preservation at the same time than say, well, this ship took that ship's slot. Which is going to be difficult, I think. Loke asks, the Danish steamer NJ Fjord merrily blowing off excess steam. This is at Jutland. What did she do when the shells started flying? I imagine she was rather bemused at seeing two inquisitive fleets being drawn to her. By all accounts, kind of, sat very quiet and hoped nobody would shoot at her. The fighting did move south relatively quickly, so she was able to kind of skedaddle after a short while. Tuning 3434. Which British naval officer would most resemble Brian Blessed in being larger than life? Probably Admiral Duncan, because he literally was larger than life and had the voice to match. Oh, at some point when I managed to finally persuade the Portsmouth dockyard to let me film on Victory, and I can finish the video series on Admiral Nelson, I've got to do a video on Admiral Duncan. He is a character. Coltax 100, worst capital ship in World War II. I'm actually going to cover this in the Drydock recorded segment of on Sunday. The proper one. When I say proper one, the non-live version. It's a little bit of a difficult one, but if you're going to go by modern capital ships in World War II, that's the worst. I actually kind of end up going with the Scharnhorst, because although I do like the Scharnhorst, I like the Scharnhorst in their theoretical twin 15-inch configuration, as opposed to their 11-inch configuration. But if you're going to go with overall worst capital ship in World War II, probably the Fusos or the Iseis. They basically sat around doing nothing for most of the war. Certainly nothing worth talking about. Ice Hunter, cancelled Sovietsky Soyuz class battleship of the Russian Navy. If they'd been built, do you think they would have been viable or effective? They didn't quite have the technology for it. They would have been they would have worked. They would have, as battleships, they would physically work. They're unlikely to just roll over and die like a HMS Captain. But they would have been hideously inefficient, which, as you probably know, as an engineer, is a cardinal sin. Stafford Thompson. Sorry I had to run to the parts store. I was just wondering if you missed my question about another development video. Maybe? I answered a couple of questions about development videos. Can't remember if there was one specifically from yourself. Mr. Beep, I recommend checking out The Great War of Archimedes. It looks good. The trailer is mostly Yamato. Okay, I will. Would the war in the DAC 303, would the war in the Pacific have been winnable for Japan had the US not signed the Naval Act of 1938 and the Two Ocean Navy Act prior to Pearl Harbor? Not really. It would just have taken longer. Yeah, the US Navy, if it had just, even if it had gone in with just the stuff that it had, the Yorktowns and Lexingtons and the Standards and the North Carolinas as well, it would have been enough, and combined with the sheer distance of the Pacific, it would have been enough for the US to hold a line long enough to bring its industry up to spin. It just would have taken longer. Coltax 100, how many ships does the Kriegsmarine need to win against the Royal Navy? Depends on the time period. So the thing is, you can have all the ships in the world, but if it's late in the war, when the Royal Navy has even more ships and air superiority, it's not going to make much odds. Whereas at the beginning of, and the thing is, at the beginning of the war as well, it's Kriegsmarine versus Royal Navy. Where they really need is a bunch of modern ships coming in maybe late 41, early 42, when the Royal Navy's fighting them, the Italians and the Japanese all at once. At which point you'd probably say maybe 8 or 9 capital ships, probably to start with, not including carriers and other stuff. Eric Vlugel asks, the Germans don't kick off World War II in Europe until 43. Where does the Plan Z Kriegsmarine stand against the Royal Navy, given 4 more years to rearm? In an interesting position, because the thing is, the Royal Navy's rearming as well. So the Royal Navy's going to have a bunch of carriers. They're probably going to have the 6 Lions, and probably something else also on build. So the German Navy will be a lot more powerful, but the Royal Navy will also be a lot more powerful. So yeah, it's 6 of one, half dozen of the other, really. The Royal, again, this is the same thing as you with World War I. The Royal Navy can outbuild the Germans, so giving the Royal Navy a bit more of a run up at things will just mean a much bigger Royal Navy. Because at that point, 5 King George V's and 6 Lions, that's 11 modern capital ships. The Germans wouldn't be able to match that, and Hood with refit and Vanguard and all of that. Fury Kitten. Favourite culture ship names Ian M. Banks from Ian M. Banks' novels, and do you think any should be used for ship names? I do like the culture ship names, but for modern warships, they're a bit too much of a break with tradition, I think, for most navies. But if you can start naming spaceships, then certainly have a go at it. So as you can probably hear, my voice is beginning to go, and I'm down to my last couple of swallows of Iron Brew, so I'm trying to get through as many people's questions as possible. Why does this keep skipping? I don't know. Kyle Hardman, when can we expect a tour of HMS Belfast? Next week. Spoilers. If I can get the video prepared in time. Archangel Glen, if you're wondering, New Orleans is named after the French town of Orleans in France. So it'd be pronounced Nouvelle Orleans. Something. Oh, okay. So it's New Orleans. New Orleans? New Orleans? Okay. Yeah, so it's not New Orleans. It's either New Orleans or New Orleans. One of the two. Ki Yong Jang, why did the Koreans use large wooden darts as cannon ammo rather than just using cannon balls? Iron's expensive in those time periods. Also, to be perfectly honest, with cannon to a great extent still in their infancy, something like a large iron-tipped wooden dart is, which to be honest was also used in a lot of contemporary early cannon-armed European warships, is going to pose much less of a risk of blowing up your gun than a cannonball would. And, well, to be honest, against the Japanese ships, they're probably about just as effective. And Japanese ships at the time were not particularly heavily built. Tungsten astatine. Why did the French not use dual-purpose guns on their destroyers? A fair number of people didn't, to be perfectly honest at that point. This is sort of the compromise. If you go for a dual-purpose gun, there's this sliding scale of, if very effective as an anti-surface weapon, and very effective as an anti-aircraft weapon, and you've got a sliding scale between them for a dual-purpose gun to arrive at a happy destination. And the French were mostly thinking about fighting in the Mediterranean, or in close confines of possibly against the Germans. In either case, in theory, they would have air cover available from France, so they didn't need to worry so much, at least in their point of view, about air attack, and they needed to worry more about knocking out enemy surface ships, so they went with surface guns. I mean, a lot of destroyers in World War II were single-purpose guns. The dual-purpose stuff it's mainly the US 5-inch 38 and then the later destroyer designs of the late 1930s that tend towards the dual purpose role. Night Driver. Why were the Japanese so obsessed with high speed over armor protection after World War One? The Tosas and Keys were the worst protected than the Nagatos and not comparable to the Nelson or Colorado. This is one of the mysteries. When I get working on the Washington Treaty and post-Washington Treaty, as well, and the designs that were supposed to be there before the Washington Treaty cut them all off, I do want to look into this a bit further because yeah, they were obsessed with blending battle cruisers and battleships, but they were quite happy to seemingly to do that at the expense of armor. It does seem odd to me. I think they were hoping that the speed would give them the tactical superiority that they could dictate the engagement, and then count on long-range fire maybe not quite being effective enough to punch through their belts, something like that. But yeah, I don't think it was the world's best design decision by a very, very long way, considering that, as you mentioned in your next bit, everyone else looked at Jutland and went, yeah, you need more protection and more firepower. And the Japanese kind of went, speed! Michael Wu, any World War II ship designs with a 9.2-inch or 17-inch main battery? Not 17-inch, but there were a few sketches of heavy cruisers for the British that were theoretically using 9.2-inch guns. Bradley says, in World War I Britain versus World War II Navy, I meant World War I tech. With World War I tech, there's not an awful lot they can take out except by sheer numbers. The smaller navies, sure, they take those out either because they haven't updated their own tech or because the numbers just aren't there. But any of the principal ones would be a very uphill struggle. I mean, maybe the French, because they only have Dunkirk and Strasbourg. Richelieu is not complete. If they can hit the Italians early enough at the beginning of the war before the Littorias are online, but to be honest, even in those cases, the treaty heavy cruisers and stuff would be a major problem. David Lopez says, in local patois, New Orleans is pronounced Norlins. 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 I can't quite put on the American accent, but Norlins. I'll give it a go. See how many people try and get me after that one. Bayard Hamar, which Dud, shell, torpedo, bomb, etc. had the potential to have the greatest impact both on the local battle and overall war? The Dud that Bismarck landed on Prince of Wales. That's certainly a thing. You could probably pick almost... there was a big torpedo spread of Mark 14s that a US submarine fired against a bunch of Japanese carriers and completely then obviously failed to do anything. Yeah, if those had all gone off, that would have been a massive impact on both the local engagement and the overall war itself. Industries Taubsauger, I think. Mine warfare in the Pacific. Bad idea for the vast open sea, but there are numerous channels and archipelagos. Did the Japanese Navy consider mines for island defense or as a force multiplier? Kind of, but they were so offensively minded that defensive measures were on something of a back burner, to be perfectly honest. They certainly would have made a certain amount of sense, especially because a lot in those numerous channels and archipelagos, a lot of the waters are relatively shallow, which, actually, to be honest, very shallow waters are not particularly brilliant for mines, but it's, well, would have been better than nothing, certainly. Okay, so we're coming up to 10 o'clock, so I think I'm going to just, my last swallow of Iron Brew. We'll do a few more questions and then we'll wrap up, because it's been a heck of a long day and I really do need to have some rest. Also, I need to upload the videos for Saturday and Sunday, because I spent most of the day producing those. Right, that's the Iron Brew gone. European Theatre World War II. Would you rather have had Saratoga instead of Ark Royal, and why? Does this change if I give you an Essex instead? If you're going to give me if you're going to time travel an Essex to the start of the war instead of Ark Royal, then I'll take it in a heartbeat, because that gives me Dauntlesses and Avengers instead of Skewers. So yeah, definitely. Saratoga instead of Ark Royal. The planes are there. Ark Royal is fairly vulnerable to torpedoes, but Saratoga's quite vulnerable to the kind of attacks that it's likely to meet in the European theatre, more so than an Essex, because one of the key things about British carriers in general, especially when they're fighting in the Mediterranean and the North Sea, is they have to learn to dodge and weave a lot. And the Saratoga, as Lexington proved, is not particularly good at dodging. It's got the air group, certainly, but I'd be in two minds. But yeah, a downtime Essex, yes, in a heartbeat, fine. It's like, yeah, the Skewers took out enough German tonnage in the Norwegian campaign. Now watch me go after the Kriegsmarine in the Norway campaign with an Essex to hand. Oh, that would be fun. Almost be like that Dark Empire, the Star Wars Dark Empire comic, when once Luke's turned to the dark side, they've got that 2-page spread of him dispatching the Imperial fleet, and he's just sort of dark. It's just like, go, my friends. That would basically be me on the bridge of a Essex class in the Norway campaign. There you go, Stafford Thompson. Was wondering if we would shoot it to another naval development video. The Mark 14 is classic. I enjoyed the How to Build A and the armour videos. Also, your last with Dr. Clark was great. Yes, there will be some more naval development videos. There's a bunch of stuff. I mean, there's how to build guns. I've got to do at some point. History of gun development. I'm still working on the evolution of the capital ship. I know I did kind of the from sail to steam and iron, but the scripts for that, because initially I was thinking, okay, I'll do Age of Sail, Ironclad era, pre-dreadnought era, World War I dreadnoughts, World War II battleships, end. And it's kind of all founded on the Ironclad era, because I've now got separate scripts going for ironclad wooden vessels like Gloire and the various sort of retrofits that they did. I've got a separate one for pure ironclad vessels, and then I've got one for the American Civil War, and that is looking dangerously like it's going to split into American Civil War riverine vessels and American Civil War ocean-going vessels, or coastal vessels mostly, if we're talking about the monitors, to be honest. Then you've got gunboats and monitors in general. Outside of the American Civil War, you've got the unarmoured large frigates and such like. Obviously, you've got, as I said, the main line of development of the ironclads. Those in and of themselves, you've got the broadside ironclad, the central battery ironclad, and the early turret ships. That line of like the main ocean-going ironclad, just in that is pushing it. I might have to just go broadside ironclads and central battery ironclads, and then do turreted ironclads separately. And there's all those scripts in the work, just to try and get far enough along the line so that I can get to pre-dreadnoughts, where at least some version of semblance of order reigns. So yeah, there will be plenty of more of those naval development videos coming. They'll just be a bit further down the line, because they do take an absolute age to get right. And I do want to try and do them right. Private Joker, how much more effective was a 40mm Bofors with a proximity fuse shell load compared to normal impact or time fuses? If I remember correctly, I believe there was a US analysis towards the end of the war that estimated it was something more like 5 times more effective with proximity fuse compared to previous fuses. Ninja X Alpaca asks, make me a super ship with the best aspects of various nations' World War II fleets. Yeah, I have invented HMS Drac, and someone actually put together a 3D model of HMS Drac, so at some point maybe I'll do some renders of it. I tried to get it 3D printed, but Shapeways didn't want to have it for some reason. At some point I'll fiddle around with my 3D printer, see if I can generate one myself. Indy, what if HMS Hood wasn't sunk at Denmark Strait? What do you think would have been its fate? It would have had to go into modernisation. Okay, there's somebody who's had far too much to drink outside. Yeah, it would have had to go into modernisation. It was really on its last legs by the time of Denmark Strait. It needed fire control upgrades. It needed its engines replaced. It needed its secondary battery replaced with more decent anti-aircraft weapons. There was so much. There was such a long list. There was probably a shorter list of what didn't need doing to Hood at that point. Mr. Happy 747. I'm going to do this one and then two more, and then I think I'm going to call it a night because I can feel my throat starting to roughen up. Mr. Happy 747. Have you ever thought about doing a video on Shackleton's various voyages to the Antarctic? And have you seen the TV show The Terror? I've got The Terror marked up to watch. I haven't seen it yet, the TV show. As for Shackleton's various voyages to the Antarctic, it's on my list of things to do. It's slightly lower down the priority list because it's not strictly a naval thing. But I do want to do it at some point. The thing is, there's just so much naval content to do, even in the relatively generally doing 1850 to 1950 and some reference further back. Out of Homebrew, yes, I'm out of Homebrew now. Kato Ho Teng Song, why did the Americans have superimposed turrets on some of their pre-dreadnoughts, and were they effective? No, they weren't particularly effective, and they weren't actually superimposed turrets. They literally just welded twin 8-inch turrets on top of the main battery turrets. They weren't independent. They were literally basically a gun house on top of the main battery. They came back to the idea once and then remembered why they stopped doing it the first time. Where's that other one? There you go. Archangel Glenn, three-way fight between Roma, Dunkirk and North Carolina. Who wins? Again, Dunkirk is far too lightly protected. And although the 13.4-inch guns it's got are quite nice, they're not really approaching the capabilities of Roma or North Carolina. I'd say it depends on shell quality. If Roma's got the kind of hilariously bad quality controlled shells that the Littorals usually ended up with, then I'd give it to North Carolina. If Roma got a decent quality batch of shells and it was a daylight engagement, I'd give it to Roma. But regardless of shell quality on the Italian ships, if it's a night engagement, I give it to North Carolina. So I guess overall, North Carolina probably is edging it a little bit there. But Roma is a very strong contender. And to say, if it was a daytime engagement and Roma actually had some decent shells, which very occasionally they did get issued, then I'd probably put Roma with a slight advantage as long as North Carolina didn't get early hits in. Zorlufton, during the Indian Ocean raid, the Japanese had 5 carriers. Why didn't they work in pairs? Yes, but one of them was in repair, so they took what they had. Pinoyslea asks, can you answer some stupid questions, please? Maybe in another live stream, but yeah, I think there was a point about the fact I was, these Drydock questions they're growing exponentially. Yeah. Last question. should we take for our very, very, very last question? I'm just scrolling up and down to see if I can pick a random one. Nagato 2044, how is it possible that Kaga's bridge was blown off? What went wrong? Is that even possible? Given the amount of explosions that happened on Kaga, pretty much everything got blown about. Yeah. When Kaga went up, when it properly went up, they're basically anything that wasn't physically bolted down, and most things that still were bolted down basically went all over the place. So yeah, that's going to probably be the last question. The only other thing I'm going to mention just before I go, I'm just going to put this to one side. The website that I've set up, I have updated it with a few more pictures. I've added a Marine Nationale page, added a few more pictures for the Italian Navy, a couple of more pictures for Royal Navy carriers. I am trying to update it as and when I've got the time. My wife's volunteered to do a bunch of scanning, so hopefully we'll see a bunch of that soon. The only other thing I would mention at this point is when that scanner arrives. I still don't know where it is, but once I get that scanner, there's a ton of really nice photos I want to get going. And yes, that is Mrs. Drac giggling in the background. I think she's found something amusing to watch on the tablet. But yes, so next live stream, I will show you some of the photos, the stack of photos and albums I've got, so you can all look forward to seeing that going. So yeah, thank you very much for listening. And Apothecary Terry asks, you make sure your website and shop are in your About page. Very good point. I will put the website in the About page when I am uploading the videos, which I'm going to do just now. Coltex, do a drunk live stream. That would be expensive. That would be very expensive, in fact. Also, I'd probably break a few YouTube rules, but I guess I don't know. Website URL is simply drakinfl.co.uk. But yeah, I don't know how I'd go about doing that. But anyway, I'm now going to head off and start uploading videos for the weekend. So thank you very much, and see you again in another stream or another video.